Every game begins with a bedroom, and something stirs inside it. A morning light filters through a curtain, a town waits just outside the door, and a young person stands at the edge of everything they do not yet know. There have been many of these young people across the generations of Pokémon, each one stepping through a different door into a different world, each carrying a different name and a different silence behind their eyes. Before you drift any further, please consider subscribing to join the Cozy Club for more videos like this, and tell me where you're watching from tonight. They are the protagonists, but the ones who never quite speak, but somehow say everything. The ones who walk through tall grass and into caves and across bridges above dark water, always moving, always arriving somewhere new. What follows is a long and unhurried look at who those travelers were, what the games quietly recorded about them, and what the world they moved through really felt like when no one was watching too closely. The first protagonist to exist in the official record was a child from Pallet Town. His canonical name, settled years later through anime and supplemental materials, was Red. He appeared in Pokémon Red and Green in Japan in February of 1996, and in Pokémon Red and Blue in other regions beginning in 1998. He was 11 years old at the time of his journey, though the games never stated this outright. The age came from official Pokémon materials, released in conjunction with the first generation, materials that described the children of Pallet as being on the younger edge of what a trainer's journey typically required. Red had very little defined about him beyond what the player gave him. His appearance in those early sprites was small and quiet. A cap pressed down over his hair, a red shirt, dark pants, a simple silhouette designed to be immediately readable on a very small screen with very limited color. The designers at Game Freak were working under significant technical constraints, and the character had to be communicative with just a few dozen pixels. What those pixels communicated when players looked at them in the late 1990s was something like readiness. He faced forward. He stood without leaning. He was the kind of figure that implied motion without showing it, and that quality of implied motion became a defining feature of every protagonist who came after him. Red's rival was a boy from the same town, later named Blue in the official materials. Blue was the grandson of Professor Oak, and that relationship shaped much of what Red's journey meant. Red was the unknown quantity, the child without connections, the one who simply showed up when the professor was not home and received a starter Pokémon that had been intended for someone else. This accident of timing, or perhaps it was not an accident at all, set the tone for what Pokémon journeys were fundamentally about. Not destiny, exactly, but readiness. The ability to receive what arrives and carry it forward with care. Red moved through the Kanto region across 8 gyms, each one led by a specialist who had devoted their life to a single type of Pokémon. He crossed Cerulean City and its shimmering bridge. He passed through Lavender Town with its purple sky and its memorial tower where the spirits of Pokémon were said to linger. He climbed the Pokémon Tower and descended into the darkness of Sylph Company, and eventually stood at the gates of the Pokémon League on the Indigo Plateau. The Indigo Plateau was not a place of grandeur in those early games. It was practical, a small building at the top of a mountain road. What made it feel significant was everything that had come before it, the accumulated weight of the journey, the choices that had built a team, the moments in tall grass and caves and on the decks of boats that had quietly shaped whatever Red had become by the time he arrived. The games that accompanied Red's original release included a female protagonist option in some of the earliest planning materials, though she did not appear in the final versions of Red and Blue. It would take several more years and several more generations before a girl would stand at the beginning of a Pokémon game and have that choice offered to her as an equal and fully developed option. Fire Red and Leaf Green, released in 2004, were remakes of the original games built for the Game Boy Advance. They brought with them a female protagonist named Leaf. She wore a red skirt and a white hat, and carried herself with the same quiet assurance that Red had always projected. Her introduction into the Kanto story was retroactive in a sense, a recognition that the original games had always implied the possibility of her presence, even when they did not include it. She moved through the same routes, battled the same gym leaders, climbed the same mountains, but her presence changed the texture of those places slightly, the way any different traveler changes the feeling of a road simply by walking it differently. Leaf's design was notable for how closely it echoed Red's, without simply mirroring it. She was distinct but complementary. Her hat brim curved in a different direction. Her colors were arranged differently. She looked like she belonged in the same world without looking like a version of someone else, and that balance would become a recurring challenge for the designers of every female protagonist who followed. Gold and Silver arrived in Japan in November of 1999 and introduced a second protagonist from a second region. His canonical name, established through later materials, including the Pokémon Adventures manga and officially confirmed by Game Freak, was Gold. He was 10 years old, the youngest age officially cited for any protagonist who begins their journey in a core series game, and he came from New Bark Town, a small settlement on the eastern edge of the Johto region where the wind blew in off open fields and smelled of new beginnings. Gold's journey was longer than Red's in certain measurable ways. The Johto region contained 8 gyms of its own, but it also connected near the end of the game to a version of Kanto that players could explore after completing the main story. This meant that Gold's world was effectively twice as large as Red's had been, though many of the Kanto locations in the Gold and Silver versions were simplified compared to their original appearances. What this expanded geography communicated was something about continuity. Pokémon was no longer just one place. It was a world that grew, that had history, that contained different regions in conversation with each other across time and space. Gold's journey across Johto was also a journey toward Kanto, and that second journey ended at Mount Silver, where Red was waiting. The encounter at the summit of Mount Silver is one of the most quietly powerful moments in all of Pokémon history. Red says nothing. He had never spoken in his own games, and here, encountered as an opponent by a new protagonist from a new generation, he remained silent. He simply stood in the snow with his team, his Pikachu, his Espeon, his Snorlax, his Venusaur, his Charizard, his Blastoise, all of them at the highest recorded levels of any trainer in any game up to that point. He was not the champion anymore. He was something beyond that designation, something the game declined to name. Gold battled him without any story explanation of why, without any fanfare. It was simply the thing that happened after everything else had happened. The new protagonist reaching the place where the old protagonist had come to wait, and the two of them standing in the cold and testing everything they had become. Crystal was the third version of the Gold and Silver games, released in Japan in December of 2000. It introduced something that no previous Pokémon game had offered in quite the same way. A female protagonist as a default and equal option from the very beginning of the experience. Her name, later established in supplemental materials, was Chris. She had high pigtails and a distinctive outfit that felt slightly more urban than the designs that had come before. Her expression, even in the small sprites of the Game Boy Color era, conveyed something alert and particular, a curiosity that felt native to her rather than borrowed from a male counterpart. Chris moved through the same Johto that Gold had moved through, but her presence in that world was genuinely her own. She was not a reskin or an afterthought. She was a designed character with her own visual identity, and the fact that she appeared as an option equal to the male protagonist from the first screen of the game was a quiet but significant shift in what Pokémon communicated about who its journeys were for. She did not return for the Heart Gold and Soul Silver remakes. That absence prompted considerable discussion among players and fans, and a new female protagonist named Lyra took her place in those games. Lyra wore a large white hat and overalls and carried herself with warmth. She was gentle in a way Chris had not been, softer at the edges. Some players mourned the absence of Chris and her particular energy. Others found Lyra entirely charming. Both responses were honest, and both said something true about how players come to understand the protagonists as people even when those protagonists never speak. Ruby and Sapphire arrived in Japan in November of 2002 and introduced the Hoenn region, a place built almost entirely on water, an archipelago where ocean routes stretched between islands, and the land itself sometimes felt like an interruption in the blue expanse. The male protagonist of those games was eventually given the canonical name Brendan, and the female protagonist was named May. Brendan's most distinctive visual feature was a white beanie with a dark band around it, and it became one of the most recognizable protagonist designs in the series. It was practical in a way that the earlier designs had not been, suggesting someone who was ready for weather, for altitude, for the kind of outdoor journey that the Hoenn region demanded. His overall design leaned into an athletic, exploratory aesthetic that matched the region's emphasis on nature and discovery. May, when she appeared, carried a similar energy in a different arrangement. Her red bandana tied at the top of her head became her defining visual note, and it communicated something breezy and confident. She moved through Hoenn with the same quiet assurance that the best Pokémon protagonists always carried, the sense that wherever the road led, she would walk it without hesitation and arrive wherever she arrived in good order. The Hoenn region asked something specific of its protagonist. It asked them to be comfortable with enormity, with the scale of weather systems and ocean depths, and the kinds of forces that make individual people feel appropriately small. The antagonist groups of that generation, and Team Magma and Team Aqua, were not simply criminal organizations trying to steal things or dominate others. They were groups with cosmological ambitions, one wanting to expand the land and one wanting to expand the sea, each believing that their vision of the world was the correct one. To move through their conflict as a protagonist was to experience something slightly vertiginous, the sense that the world itself was in contention and that a single journey through it was somehow also a journey through the question of what the world should be. Emerald was the third version of the Hoenn games, released in Japan in September of 2004, and it sharpened the world of Brendan and May by asking them to navigate both antagonist groups simultaneously. The battle frontier also appeared in Emerald, a place of elaborate competitive challenges that extended the journey long after the main story had concluded. A protagonist who cleared the battle frontier had accomplished something that went beyond saving the world. They had demonstrated a kind of sustained excellence that the main journey only hinted at. The remakes of the Hoenn games, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, arrived in 2014 on the Nintendo 3DS and brought with them updated designs for both Brendan and May. Their new appearances leaned into something slightly more stylized and modern without losing the essential qualities that had made the original designs memorable. Brendan's white beanie remained, May's red bandana remained, but the lines around them were crisper and the colors were more saturated, and the world they moved through was rendered with a visual richness that the original games had only been able to suggest. The fourth generation brought Diamond and Pearl to Japan in September of 2006, and with them came two new protagonists from Twin Leaf Town in the Sinnoh region. The male protagonist was named Lucas, and the female was named Dawn. They moved through a region built on the idea of depth, of mythology, of the kind of ancient cosmological narrative that sat underneath the surface of ordinary things and occasionally broke through. Dawn became one of the most beloved female protagonists in the series, in part because of her extensive role in the Pokémon anime. The animated series ran a storyline covering the Sinnoh region that gave Dawn a full arc of her own, one centered on Pokémon contests, on the idea of performance and artistry alongside the more typical emphasis on battle. She pursued excellence in a different domain than most of the anime's focus had previously allowed, and her storyline gave her emotional beats and growth that players recognized as continuous with the character they had known in the games. Lucas, meanwhile, carried a blue scarf and a white beanie that echoed the practical weather-ready aesthetic Brendan had established, appropriate for a region where snowfields and mountain passes were part of the ordinary geography. His design was quieter than some of the protagonists who came before and after him, less immediately arresting, but deeply consistent with the landscape he moved through. Sinnoh asked its protagonist to grapple with time and space as literal forces. The antagonist Cyrus sought to destroy and remake the universe, to eliminate spirit and emotion from existence, and construct something he considered perfect in their place. The protagonists of Diamond and Pearl stood against this not because they were powerful in any obvious sense, but because they kept arriving. They kept walking through the roots, and the caves, and the mountains, and the ancient temples until they were standing where they needed to stand when the moment required it. Platinum refined the Sinnoh experience in 2008 and brought with it the Distortion World, an inverted space where Giratina existed outside of normal geography. The protagonist walked through a place where waterfalls flowed sideways and platforms floated in indefinite space, and the design of that environment was the most directly surreal that any mainline Pokémon game had attempted. To walk through it was to understand something about Sinnoh that Diamond and Pearl had only implied, that this was a region where the foundations of reality were accessible, where the deep structures beneath ordinary experience could be found and traversed if you were willing to walk far enough. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl arrived in 2021 and returned Lucas and Dawn to a version of Sinnoh rendered in a chibi style that preserved the original proportions of the characters while updating the world around them. The choice of art direction was deliberate, an acknowledgement that these games were remakes in a more literal sense than the series had previously attempted, honoring the exact shape of the original experience while giving it new texture and color. Black and White arrived in Japan in September of 2010 and brought with them the most striking departure in protagonist design the series had yet attempted. The male protagonist was named Hilbert and the female was named Hilda, and their designs were immediately notable for how different they felt from everything that had come before. Hilda's signature piece was a large white hat with a wide brim and a distinctive cap worn beneath it, giving her an impression of layered style that felt genuinely urban rather than outdoor or exploratory. Her tall boots and her confident posture communicated something assertive and fashion-aware in a way that previous female protagonists had gestured toward without quite committing to. She looked like someone who had thought about how they wanted to move through the world and had made deliberate choices about it. Hilbert's design echoed some of that same intentionality. His baseball cap and his vest suggested a different kind of readiness than the weatherproof aesthetic of Sinnoh and Hoenn, something more flexible and urban, the kind of outfit worn by someone who expected to move through cities as often as through wilderness. Unova, the region of Black and White, was based in its broad geography on the northeastern United States, the first Pokémon region to draw explicitly from North American inspiration rather than Japanese landscape. It was dense with cities, with bridges over wide rivers, with the kind of concentrated urban energy that previous regions had contained only in pieces. The protagonist moved through it in a way that felt genuinely different from the journeys through Kanto and Johto and Hoenn and Sinnoh, faster and more compressed, more aware of the city around the route rather than just the route itself. The antagonist of Black and White was N, a young man who had been raised among Pokémon and who believed that keeping Pokémon was a form of cruelty, that the relationship between humans and Pokémon was fundamentally exploitative and needed to end. He was the most philosophically developed antagonist the series had produced to that point, a character who was not wrong in every way, who raised questions that the protagonist could not simply dismiss with superior battling skill. The confrontation between Hilbert or Hilda and N was unlike any previous protagonist-antagonist encounter in the series. It required something closer to genuine engagement, an acknowledgement that the questions N raised were real questions, even if the answers he had arrived at were incomplete or mistaken. The protagonists of Black and White were not simply heroes who defeated a villain. They were participants in a genuine argument about the nature of partnership and freedom, and their journey through Unova was shaped by that argument at every turn. Black 2 and White 2 arrived in Japan in June of 2012 and introduced new protagonists to the same region 2 years after the events of Black and White. The male protagonist was named Nate, and the female was named Rosa. They came from Aspertia City, a new settlement in the southwestern part of Unova, and they moved through a region that had changed since Hilbert and Hilda had crossed it. Rosa's design carried forward something of the layered confidence that Hilda had established, though it arranged that confidence differently. Her twin tails and her skirt and her particular way of standing communicated a lightness that Hilda's more grounded assertiveness had not. She looked like someone who found joy easily and pursued it with the same focus that others brought to more serious things. Nate was similarly distinct from Hilbert, his design leaner and more compact, his hat worn differently. They were clearly from the same world as their predecessors, without being extensions of them, a distinction that the games built into their premise by setting the story 2 years later and by giving Nate and Rosa their own relationships and their own history with the changed Unova around them. The Pokémon World Tournament appeared in Black 2 and White 2 as a location where champions and gym leaders from every previous region could be battled, and the protagonists of those games thus became the first to stand in direct comparison with every major trainer figure the series had produced. That comparison was handled quietly through gameplay rather than story, but its implications were significant. Nate and Rosa, by competing in and eventually winning the World Tournament, joined a lineage that stretched back to Red's silent confrontation with Blue at the Indigo Plateau. X and Y arrived in October of 2013, simultaneously worldwide, the first Pokémon games to launch on the same date in all major markets. They introduced the Kalos region, based on France, a place of boulevards and cafes and graceful architecture and the kind of aesthetic attention that the French landscape has always generated in the imaginations of people who love beautiful things. The male protagonist was named Callum, and the female was named Serena. Their designs were the most fashion-forward the series had yet produced, matching the character of the region they moved through. Serena, in particular, with her large floppy hat and her stylish clothing, communicated something about the way beauty and intention could coexist in the same person without either one diminishing the other. Kalos was a region with a dark history beneath its elegant surface. The ultimate weapon, an ancient device capable of destroying all life in a vast radius, had been activated once before, millennia ago. and the remnants of that event shaped the story of X and Y from beneath. The protagonist moved through a place of extraordinary beauty while gradually uncovering the horror that had once been done in the name of preserving that beauty, and the tension between those two things, between the graceful surface and the terrible foundation, gave the Kalos journey its particular emotional character. Callum and Serena also moved through Kalos with a group of friends who accompanied them across much of the journey, a design choice that made the protagonist feel less solitary than in previous games. Shauna and Tierno and Trevor were present at significant moments, their reactions and conversations giving the world a sense of inhabited companionship that the earlier games had provided only through the presence of rivals. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire arrived in November of 2014, as mentioned, but they also introduced something that the original Hoenn games had not contained: a post-game story involving the Delta episode, in which the protagonist confronted a threat from space itself, a meteorite carrying a Rayquaza-level event that required both courage and the specific history of the Hoenn region to resolve. The Delta episode asked Brendan or May to stand at the edge of the atmosphere and face something that previous protagonists had not been asked to face in quite the same terms. It was a story about the world being genuinely small relative to the universe, and about the protagonist being nevertheless the person who needed to act. That sense of scale, of smallness, that is still sufficient, is one of the recurring emotional truths of Pokémon journeys across all their generations. Sun and Moon arrived in Japan in November of 2016 and brought with them the Alola region based on Hawaii, a place of volcanic islands and abundant sunshine, and a culture built on the relationship between people and the land they lived on. The male protagonist was named Elio, and the female was named Selene, and they were distinct from all previous protagonists in a specific and significant way. They were children who had just moved to a new place. Elio and Selene began their journey not as residents of the region they were exploring, but as newcomers, and that quality of being new gave their movement through Alola a specific texture. They were not uncovering a home they already knew. They were discovering a home they were in the process of making, and the people and traditions they encountered along the way were things they came to as genuine arrivals rather than as inheritors. Alola was also the region that most explicitly built its story around family. The antagonist, Lusamine, was the president of the Ether Foundation and the mother of Lily and Gladion, two characters who became central to the emotional core of the games. The relationship between a mother and her children, the damage done by certain kinds of love, and the healing required afterward shaped the Sun and Moon narrative in ways that were more directly personal than anything the series had previously attempted. Lily traveled alongside the protagonist across much of Alola, and her development across that journey became one of the most emotionally resonant character arcs the series had produced. She began afraid of touching Pokémon, and ended having grown into herself enough to face her mother and tell her own truth. The protagonist, Elio or Selene, was both witness and participant in that arc, and their presence through it, their consistent companionship, was what made it possible. The Island Challenge of Alola replaced the gym structure of previous regions with a series of trials conducted on each of the 4 main islands. Captains led these trials, and the totems who waited at their end were Pokémon specially enhanced by the energy of their island. The protagonist moved through this structure differently than they had moved through gyms, the challenges feeling more varied and more embedded in the specific character of each island, rather than simply testing one type of Pokémon specialty. Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, released in November of 2017, expanded the Alola story with new dimensions literally, with ultra wormholes connecting Alola to other worlds and to the home dimensions of the Ultra Beasts, alien Pokémon from across the boundaries of ordinary space. The protagonist of those games moved through realities that the original sun and moon had only gestured toward, deepening the cosmological implications of the Alola journey in ways that were continuous with what Diamond and Pearl had done for Sinnoh. Sword and Shield arrived in November of 2019 and introduced the Galar region based on Great Britain, a place of rolling fields and old stone architecture and an industrial and sports culture that gave the experience of Pokémon battles a different kind of cultural framing than previous regions had offered. The male protagonist was named Victor, and the female was named Gloria. Gloria's design became immediately distinctive and beloved. Her large, floppy tam and her layered outfit communicated something warmly specific to the British Isles, to the kind of weather-comfortable but stylish sensibility that the culture genuinely carries. She looked like someone from that specific place in the way that few previous protagonists had looked so clearly and comfortably like someone from the region they moved through. Victor carried a similar regional specificity in his own design, his jacket and his general posture communicating something about the sporting culture of Galar, about a region where Pokémon battles were broadcast events attended by enormous crowds and celebrated with the kind of intensity normally reserved for football matches. The Dynamax phenomenon of the Galar region allowed Pokémon to grow to enormous size during certain battles, a mechanic that leaned into the spectacle of the stadium setting and gave the gym challenge a different visual register than any previous generation's gym system. The Pokémon grew to fill arenas. The crowd reacted. The protagonist stood at the center of that spectacle and battled through it with the same quiet focus that all Pokémon protagonists had always brought to their journeys. The Crown Tundra and Isle of Armor expansions for Sword and Shield extended Victor and Gloria's journey into new territories, one cold and ancient and full of legendary Pokémon, one warm and training-focused and populated by a dojo culture that tested the protagonist in different ways than the main game had. These expansions gave the Galar protagonists a fuller geographical experience than the base game alone provided, and they built on the established emotional rhythms of the Sword and Shield story without simply repeating them. Scarlet and Violet arrived in November of 2022 and introduced the Paldea region based on the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, and Portugal, a place of dramatic landscapes, ancient ruins, and a school system that organized the experience of becoming a Pokémon trainer within an academic framework. The male protagonist was named Florian, and the female was named Juliana, though the games allowed players to move between these identities more fluidly than previous games had. The treasure hunt that organized the Paldea journey was one of the most genuinely open structures the series had produced. 3 storylines unfolded simultaneously, and the protagonist could pursue them in any order, moving across the map in any direction, finding Titan Pokémon or Team Star bases or gym leaders wherever the terrain led. This openness gave the Paldea protagonists a different relationship to their region than any previous generation had offered. Not a linear path through a world, but an expansive field to be crossed in whatever direction felt most compelling. Paldea was also a region where the protagonist moved through the world on the back of a rideable Pokémon, Koraidon or Miraidon, ancient and futuristic versions of the same base creature existing across a temporal gap that the story of Scarlet and Violet gradually revealed. The relationship between the protagonist and their rideable companion was built into the visual and mechanical language of every journey across the region, and it gave the Paldea story an emotional anchor that the more solitary protagonist experiences of earlier generations had not always found. The DLC expansions for Scarlet and Violet, the Teal Mask, and the Indigo Disc sent the Paldea protagonist to Kitakami, a traditional Japanese countryside setting, and then to Blueberry Academy, an underwater institution with its own culture and its own challenges. These expansions broadened the world of Florian and Juliana in ways that also broadened the world of Paldea itself, connecting it to traditions and places that the Iberian-inspired main region had not contained. Legends Arceus, released in January of 2022, took a different approach entirely. Its protagonist, male or female, and later named Rei or Akari in supplemental materials, fell from a modern time into the ancient Hisui region, the land that would eventually become Sinnoh. They arrived without context, without family, without any of the established frameworks that ordinary Pokémon protagonists begin with. Rei and Akari were explicitly immigrants in a temporal sense, people from another time who had to build their place in a world that did not yet know them. The Galaxy team that organized the first systematic study of Pokémon in that ancient region became their community, their grounding, their way of understanding where they were and what they could contribute. The work they did there, the gradual mapping and research and careful observation of wild Pokémon that had never before been approached in an organized way, was the most procedurally different protagonist experience the series had offered. The relationship between Rei or Akari and the wild Pokémon of Hisui was also meaningfully different from what previous protagonists had experienced. Wild Pokémon in Legends Arceus were genuinely dangerous, capable of charging and injuring the protagonist directly. The careful, patient approach required to observe and catch them without triggering aggression created a texture of engagement that felt appropriate to that ancient setting and to the idea of a person truly at the beginning of something, without the support structures that later generations of trainers would take for granted. The story of Legends Arceus culminated in an encounter with Arceus, the Pokémon said to have shaped existence itself, and the protagonist's ability to communicate with and ultimately work alongside that being was framed not as a triumph of strength, but as a recognition of intention. They had come to this time and this place, and they had done the work that was needed. That was what earned the encounter. That was what made it possible. The Pokémon Snap games occupy a different place in the protagonist's story, but they are worth considering briefly here because they introduce a perspective on the world of Pokémon that the core series protagonists never quite inhabit. Todd Snap in the original game and Alex in New Pokémon Snap moved through environments as observers and documentarians rather than as trainers and battlers. Their tools were cameras, and their goal was attention, the careful noticing of how Pokémon behaved when people were quiet and present, but not demanding anything. This different mode of protagonisthood illuminated something about the world that the battling games could only gesture toward. The Pokémon of the Snap games lived complex lives independent of their trainers. They played and rested and interacted and moved through their environments according to their own interests. The protagonist of a Snap game was not at the center of that activity, but at its edge, welcome in the world only insofar as they were willing to observe rather than impose. Todd Snap, as a character who appeared in both the original game and in the early episodes of the Pokémon anime, became a small but genuine part of the extended protagonist tradition, a reminder that the world of Pokémon contained multiple ways of engaging with the creatures who shared it, and that not all of those ways required a Pokéball or a battle. The Pokémon Ranger series introduced yet another kind of protagonist, one who captured Pokémon not with balls, but with a device called a styler, which created a connection through motion rather than through containment. Lunac and Solana in the original Ranger game, Kellen and Kate in Ranger Shadows of Almia, and Ben and Summer in Ranger Guardian Signs, each moved through a world where Pokemon assistance was temporary and relational rather than permanent and owned. These protagonists were interesting precisely because of what they did not keep. Every other Pokemon protagonist in the core series accumulated a party, built relationships over extended time, and carried those relationships as the primary resource of their journey. Ranger protagonists helped Pokémon and then released them over and over across the full length of their games. What accumulated instead was skill and reputation, a growing recognition within their communities of what they were capable of and what they could be trusted with. This different model of protagonisthood asked different questions about what the relationship between a human and a Pokémon could be. Not ownership, not partnership in the most permanent sense, but a series of genuine connections across time, each one complete in itself and then released so that something new could arrive. What connects all of these protagonists across all of their different regions and generations is harder to name than it is to feel, but it has something to do with the quality of their movement. They all walk toward things, they all keep arriving. They face new places with the same open posture, the same willingness to be wherever they find themselves and to do what is needed there. Red stands silently at the top of Mount Silver and waits. Gold climbs through the snow to reach him. May and Brendan cross the ocean between Hone's islands without hesitation. Hilda and Hilbert stand in the conflict of Unova's ideological storm and do not step back. Selene or Elio makes a new home out of a place they did not know. Gloria moves through Galar's stadiums with the same composure that Red once moved through Kanto's roots. The settings change. The stakes change. The visual language of each generation shifts with the hardware and the times. But something persists through all of it, some quality of readiness and attention that every protagonist carries and that the games build their worlds around. There are details about the protagonists that exist only in the margins of official materials, in interviews given by developers, in Teian manga and guidebooks, and encyclopedia entries that most players never encounter directly. These details accumulate into a picture of people who are more defined than the games sometimes make visible. Red, in the Pokémon Adventures manga, which Game Freak has acknowledged as the most faithful, non-game representation of the Pokémon world, is competitive and clever and sometimes reckless, a person who learns through experience and who forms genuine bonds with his Pokémon as individuals rather than as a collection. He treats Pikachu as a partner and confidant in ways that the silent sprite of the games cannot communicate directly, but that feel continuous with what the games imply. Blue, his rival, is in that same material, a person whose bravado conceals something lonelier, someone who trained hard and fast toward a goal he understood only in terms of being the best, without yet understanding what being the best was supposed to feel like from the inside. His eventual development into a more genuinely reflective person across the events of Gold and Silver's story, when he appears as the gym leader of Viridian City, feels like the conclusions of something that began the moment he ran ahead of Red, at the start of everything. Gold in the Adventures manga is wild and energetic, a person who approaches everything with a physical and emotional directness that makes him immediately distinct from Red's more calculated intensity. He rushes into situations. He improvises. He cares loudly and openly rather than quietly, and at a distance. His journey feels like a different kind of answer to the same fundamental question that Red's journey posed. The rivals of the protagonist's generation are as much a part of the protagonist's story as the protagonists themselves, and they repay attention as figures in their own right. Barry of the Sinnoh games, who ran everywhere and crashed into the protagonist at regular intervals and promised to fine them for various offenses, communicated something about ambition that was more anxious than Blue's arrogance, less settled in itself, more driven by a genuine uncertainty about what he was trying to prove and to whom. His eventual arrival at the Pokémon League and his defeat there was not a tragedy, but a necessary part of his education, the thing that allowed him to understand what he was actually training for. Charon and Bianca of the Unova games were different kinds of rivals, each pursuing the journey with a different set of questions. Charon wanted strength. He wanted to be the best in a way he had not yet examined for its ultimate justification. Bianca was less certain, more openly in the process of discovering what she wanted, and her journey was in some ways more honest than Charon's, precisely because she had not yet committed to a story about herself that might prove to be wrong. The protagonist of Black and White stood between them, and their different trajectories gave the Unova journey a human depth that went beyond the protagonist's own arc. Hop of the Galar games was perhaps the most emotionally developed rival the series had produced in terms of the explicit attention the story paid to his inner experience. His struggle with his own expectations, with the weight of his brother Leon's enormous success, with the question of who he was when he was not defined by that comparison, was handled with genuine care. His eventual decision to pursue Pokémon research rather than continue competing was framed not as a failure, but as a genuine discovery, a finding of what he was actually for. The clothing and visual design of the protagonist carries meaning that goes beyond aesthetics. Each design communicates something about the region and the generation it belongs to, but it also communicates something about the protagonist as a type of person and about what Pokémon is inviting players to be when they take that person's role. Red's practical simplicity said, "You are ready. The journey requires nothing special of you beyond showing up." Hilda's confident style said, "You have an identity that you bring to the journey, not one the journey gives you." Selena's fresh arrival quality said, "You are new here, and that is not a disadvantage." Gloria's warm regional specificity said, "Where you come from matters and is visible in how you move." These are not arbitrary choices. They are a visual language developed across nearly 3 decades of iterative design that has become increasingly sophisticated in what it communicates about the relationship between a protagonist and their world. The hat, in particular, has been a consistent visual anchor across nearly every generation of Pokémon protagonist. Red had his red cap. Brendan had his white beanie. Lucas had his blue beanie with white brim. Callum had his structured cap. Victor had his tam. The hat marks the protagonist as a specific kind of person, someone equipped for movement, for weather, for the outdoors, and it does so in a way that is immediately readable, regardless of the size or resolution of the sprite or model that wears it. The evolution of hat design across the generations also tracks the evolution of the regions themselves, from the simple, functional caps of the early games to the more elaborate and culturally specific headwear of the later generations. The hat has always been a small but precise indicator of where the protagonist is from and what that place values. The starter Pokémon that each protagonist receives at the beginning of their journey is another dimension of the protagonist's story that deserves its own careful attention, because the starter is in many ways the protagonist's first real decision and the one that shapes everything that follows. Red could choose Bulbasaur, Charmander, or Squirtle. These 3 choices encoded different approaches to the journey. Bulbasaur for the patient and methodical, who wanted to build advantages gradually. Charmander for the ambitious, who was willing to accept early difficulty in exchange for later power. Squirtle for the balanced, who wanted reliable options across multiple situations. The choice did not determine success, but it did determine the texture of the journey, the specific moments of ease and difficulty that the protagonist would encounter along the way. Gold could choose Chikorita, Cyndaquil, or Totodile. Chikorita again for the patient, and it asked more of that patience than Bulbasaur had, because the Johto gyms did not favor grass types in their early arrangement. Cyndaquil for the steady, building toward a power that arrived gradually. Totodile for the aggressive, wanting to hit hard and often from the beginning. Brendan and May in Hoenn chose among Trico, Torchic, and Mudkip, and those choices were accompanied by a different understanding of what the region demanded. Hoenn's water routes meant that the Mudkip line had a particular relevance to the geography, but all three were viable, and all three said something about the kind of trainer the protagonist intended to become. Each generation brought new starters, new trios encoding new approaches to the question of what kind of journey this one would be. The starter Pokémon was always the protagonist's first companion, the one who had been present from the beginning and whose growth was continuous with the protagonist's own, and that relationship of continuous accompaniment gave the starter a significance that later caught Pokémon, however beloved, could not quite replicate. The Pokémon champions that each protagonist eventually faces and sometimes becomes are figures who illuminate the protagonist's journey by contrast and by aspiration. Cynthia of the Sinnoh region is often cited as one of the most formidable and most beloved champions the series has produced, and her design and character communicated something about what the position of champion actually meant. She was a researcher and a scholar as much as a battler, someone for whom the mastery of Pokémon was continuous, with a broader intellectual engagement with the world. She quoted ancient mythology. She traveled to study ruins. She brought her curiosity to her battles in a way that felt like a different kind of strength than simple power. Stephen Stone of the Hoenn region was a collector and a geologist, someone who loved the earth itself and who understood Pokémon through the lens of what the land they lived on was made of. His Steel-type team was an expression of his personality as much as a competitive strategy, and the fact that he stepped down from the champion position when he felt that someone better was ready to hold, it was a kind of grace that the protagonist's arc made possible. Iris of the Unova region, who appeared as champion in Black 2 and White 2 after having been introduced as a gym leader in Black and White, carried a youth and directness that was distinctive among champions. She was someone who had grown into her position naturally, through her relationship with dragon-type Pokémon, and through the guidance of the elder dragons she lived among, and her presence as champion made the role feel more continuous with the journey that preceded it, rather than something that waited at the end of a separate road. There is a quality in the best Pokémon journeys that has something to do with the relationship between movement and discovery, between the act of going somewhere and the act of understanding what you find when you arrive. The protagonists of every generation have been the vehicle for that relationship, the element that connects the player to the world and makes the discovery personal rather than abstract. When Red climbed Cerulean Cave and found Mewtwo waiting in the darkness, the encounter was significant, not because Mewtwo was objectively powerful, though it was, but because the protagonist had traveled to that place and stood in that darkness and faced what was there. The journey to the encounter was what gave the encounter its weight. When Gold climbed Mount Silver and found Red waiting in the snow, the encounter was significant not because of what was said, because nothing was said, but because both of them had arrived. Two protagonists of different generations, standing in the same cold air, with everything their separate journeys had made them. When Selena or Elio stood at the summit of the altar of the Suna or Moon, having followed Nebi across the islands and through ultraspace to find the truth of what the Ether Foundation had been doing and what Lusamine had become, the encounter was significant. It's because of Lily. Because the protagonist had been present through Lily's whole journey, and her courage at that moment was continuous with everything that had accumulated between them. The protagonists do not speak in these moments. They do not need to. Their presence is their speech. Their arrival is their answer to whatever question the world has been posing. The games have, across their history, gradually expanded the ways in which the protagonist can express their character within the limitations of the silent protagonist structure. Customization options for hair and skin tone and clothing have become increasingly robust, allowing players to construct a protagonist who looks more like them or more like the person they want to move through the world as. The inclusion of dark skin options, beginning in a more systematic way in the fifth generation and expanding significantly in subsequent ones, changed who could see themselves in the protagonist's quiet face at the beginning of the journey. These changes were not cosmetic in the dismissive sense that word is sometimes used. They were an extension of the fundamental promise of the protagonist structure, that this person on the screen is a vessel for you, that their journey is your journey, that when they walk through tall grass and into the unknown, it is you walking with them. The ability to make that person look like you, in whatever way matters most to the person playing, deepened the authenticity of that promise. Sun and Moon expanded this most significantly, offering extensive options for hair color and style and skin tone and eye color that allowed players to construct a protagonist who felt genuinely personal. The Alala region's multicultural, Hawaiian-inspired setting made these options feel continuous with the world rather than incidental to it. A region built on the meeting of different cultures and traditions offered a protagonist space that could meaningfully accommodate different expressions of who the player was. The Pokémon anime's protagonists run parallel to the game protagonists and occasionally intersect with them in significant ways, but the anime's Ash Ketchum, who remained the central protagonist of the animated series from its beginning in 1997 until 2023, occupied a different kind of protagonist space than the game characters do. Ash was a speaking, emoting, developing character whose growth over the course of the series was gradual and observable across hundreds of episodes. He made friends, made mistakes, lost battles he should have won, and won some he should have lost, and grew in ways that could be tracked across the years. He was, in certain respects, the most fully realized Pokémon protagonist in terms of the kind of character development that narrative fiction typically provides, precisely because the anime format gave him time and dialogue and relationships across which that development could unfold. His eventual achievement of the World Coronation Series Championship in 2022 was the culmination of a storyline that had begun in the very first episode, and his departure from the series in early 2023 was handled with a kind of gentleness that honored everything that had accumulated over 25 years. He went home to Pallet Town. He played with his old Pokémon. He set off again toward something new, and the camera followed him only a little way before letting him go. The new protagonists who took over the anime after Ash's departure, Liko and Roy, carried the tradition forward into the world of Paldea and beyond. They were younger and less experienced than Ash had been at his most recent, and their journeys back toward the beginning of what a Pokémon journey can be felt like an honest and necessary renewal. What is it about these protagonists, across all their generations and iterations and media, that has held so much of the world's attention for so long? The question deserves at least an attempt at an answer, even if no answer can be complete. Part of it is the silence. A protagonist who does not speak leaves space for the player, and that space, once entered, becomes personal in a way that a fully voiced and characterized protagonist cannot quite replicate. The player's own thoughts and intentions fill the silence. The protagonist's face, when it is visible, is not expressing something the player needs to interpret, but is waiting for the player's own experience to find a shape within it. Part of it is the simplicity of the initial situation. You wake up, someone gives you a Pokémon, you go outside. Everything after that is discovery. The initial conditions of every Pokémon game are almost provocatively simple, and that simplicity is what allows the journey to expand into something enormous without ever losing the thread of personal connection that began in a bedroom in a small town with a window looking out at grass that was a little too tall. Part of it is the companions. The Pokémon who travel with the protagonist are not tools or accessories. They are, in the language the games have always used, partners. They have preferences. They grow. Some of them are difficult, and some of them are easy, and some of them surprise you in the middle of a battle you thought you understood. They are the most consistent element of every protagonist's experience, more consistent even than the journey's structure, or the antagonists, or the champions, and their relationship to the protagonist is the heart of what the games are about. The protagonist chooses their Pokémon. The Pokémon, in whatever way the games model this, choose the protagonist back. That exchange of choice, that mutual election, is what the journey is built around, and what gives its various trials and discoveries their meaning. There is a world of Pokémon that exists outside the games in the broad sense, in trading cards and animated films and merchandise and the shared cultural space that the franchise has occupied for nearly 3 decades. In all of that world, the protagonist remains recognizable and consistent. The cap, the backpack, the expression of quiet readiness, the starter Pokémon walking alongside. These are the marks of a Pokémon protagonist, and they communicate something that transcends any specific game or region or generation. They communicate the beginning. They are what the beginning looks like. A person at the edge of a town, the tall grass just ahead, a Pokémon beside them that they have only just met and already started to know. Everything that follows is unknown. The world is wide. The road goes everywhere from here. Red knew this, standing in Pallet Town before he took his first step. Selene knew this, arriving in Alola with her mother and looking out at a region that was not yet home. Gloria knew this, stepping out into Galar with Hop running ahead and the first gym somewhere distant, and the sky above the route, the particular shade of morning it always is at the start of things. The protagonists, across all their generations, have always been young. Not childishly young in every case, but young in the sense of being at the beginning of something, young in the sense of having everything still ahead of them. The games have occasionally gestured toward what comes after, toward the professor the protagonist might become, or the champion who continues to defend the title, or the researcher who takes what they learned on the road and builds something with it. But these gestures are brief, and the camera always returns to the beginning. This is intentional. Pokémon is a series about the beginning of things, about the particular quality of readiness that exists before experience has yet accumulated. Every new generation offers a new beginning, a new protagonist who does not know yet what they will discover, a new world that is only as known as the distance the protagonist has traveled into it. The protagonists are young because the journey is always new. They are quiet because the journey speaks for itself. They arrive wherever they arrive because arriving is what the journey requires. And they face what is ahead with an openness that does not waver because the world of Pokémon has always been the kind of world that rewards the willingness to simply keep walking forward into what is next. The towns that protagonists leave from carry as much meaning as the journeys themselves. Pallet Town in Kanto was defined by its smallness, by the absence of anything that would suggest a grand beginning. Its name in Japanese, Masara Town, carried the meaning of pure white, a blank canvas, a beginning before any color has been applied. The protagonist who left that town carried its blankness with them as a kind of openness, a willingness to be defined by the journey rather than by the place of origin. New Bark Town in Johto carried a different implication in its name and in its geography. Wind came through that town. It sat at the edge of the region, at the beginning of roots that spread outward in multiple directions. The protagonist who left New Bark Town left into possibility in the specific sense of having multiple immediate directions available, each one leading somewhere different. Little Root Town in Hoenn, the town Brennans and May came from, was described in the games as a town that cannot be highlighted on any map. a place so new that the ink had barely dried, a settlement still being established rather than one that had already defined itself. The protagonist of Hoenn came from a place that was in the process of becoming, and that quality of in the process of becoming followed them across a region full of geological and meteorological drama. Twinleaf Town in Sinnoh was defined by its twinness, by the fact that two houses sat there with two children. Inside them, the protagonist and Barry mirror starts to mirror journeys that would diverge across the geography of Sinnoh. The mythology of the Sinnoh region, concerned with pairs and complements, and the origins of time and space as dual forces, began in the structural implication of two towns becoming one. Nuvema Town in Unova sat at the southeastern edge of the region, far from Castelia City and Nimbasa and all the dense urban energy that defined the black and white experience. Leaving Nuvema Town required crossing open land, approaching the cities gradually, arriving at their density after passing through quiet routes that softened the transition. The protagonist of Unova came from the edge and moved toward the center, and that movement from periphery to center was continuous with the story's concern with what it meant to be at the margin of an argument about the nature of civilization. Aspercha City in western Unova, the origin point of Nate and Rosa in Black 2 and White 2, was the first starting location in the core series to be called a city rather than a town, and it was also positioned differently on the map than Nuvema had been, in the southwest rather than the southeast. This different position gave Nate and Rosa a different initial relationship to the expanded Unova around them, one that required crossing the southern routes before reaching the familiar geography of the original games. Vanaville Town in Kalos was small and quiet in the way that most protagonist origin points were small and quiet, but it sat in the southern part of a region that opened northward, so Callum and Serena moved upward across Kalos toward its grandest city at its center. This northward movement toward Lumiose City with its great tower and its sense of cultural accumulation gave the Kalos journey a feeling of approach, of moving toward something specific rather than simply through something vast. Littleroot's Hoenn counterpart in the later games, the various towns where Sun and Moon and Sword and Shield and Scarlet and Violet protagonists began, each carried their own specific implications. But the pattern was consistent: a small place, a large world, and a protagonist standing at the edge of one, looking toward the other. The routes that connect these towns to each other are often treated as simple transition spaces, corridors between the places where things happen. But the roots of the Pokémon world are themselves places where things happen, and the protagonist's experience of them is as much a part of the journey as any gym battle or story confrontation. Route 1 in Kanto was the first route as any protagonist walked, and its design encoded everything that the following hours of the game would teach in more complex form. Short grass on either side, a patch of taller grass where Pokémon might appear, a few items scattered in the corners for those willing to explore. The route was a lesson disguised as a corridor, showing the protagonist what the road was and what it required before anything difficult arrived. The routes of Sinnoh were longer and more internally varied than those of previous regions, reflecting the geography of a region built on wide plains and mountain passes and lake districts. They took time to cross, and that time contained things: wild Pokémon in different conditions, trainers who wanted to battle, occasional passages of story relevance that expanded the protagonist's understanding of the region they were moving through. The underground tunnels of Sinnoh, accessible from many points along the surface routes, added a vertical dimension to the protagonist's movement through the region that previous games had only hinted at. Mining for fossils and treasure in those tunnels was one of the ways the protagonist could engage with the world beneath the world, and the experience of descending into the underground and then returning to the surface enriched the sense of Sinnoh as a place with genuine geological and historical depth. The caves of Unova were different in character from those of Kanto and Sinnoh, darker and more structured, designed with the urban density of the region around them in mind. The protagonists moved through them with a sense of the cities that waited above, and the wild Pokémon found in those caves were continuous with the themes of the broader region, creatures that had adapted to darkness and to enclosed space in ways that mirrored Unova's own urban adaptations. The sky routes of later games, accessed by flying mounts and by the sky battles that X and Y introduced, gave the protagonist of the Kalos games a vertical relationship to their world that earlier generations had not quite provided. To look down at the routes and towns from above was to see the geography of the region in a way that no previous protagonist had been given, and that view changed that understanding of where the journey was happening and what the land below actually looked like from the perspective of the birds and the flying types who knew it best. The Pokémon League in each region is the culmination point of the protagonist's official journey, the place where the accumulated strength of the road is tested in its most formal and concentrated form. But the leagues of different regions communicate different things about what mastery means in the context of their particular world. The Kanto League at the Indigo Plateau communicated mastery as victory, pure and simple. The Elite Four and the Champion were the strongest trainers accessible to the protagonist, and defeating them established something definitive about what the protagonist had become on the road through 8 gyms and countless battles with ordinary trainers and wild Pokémon. The Sinnoh League at the Pokémon League building atop Victory Road communicated mastery as something earned through endurance as much as through skill. Victory Road in Sinnoh was longer and more demanding than its counterparts in earlier regions, and the protagonist who emerged from it onto the plateau had done so through a sustained expenditure of resource and attention that felt like a genuine final test rather than simply a final corridor. The Unova League was notable for how it was embedded in the story of the games rather than standing separate from it. In Black and White, the protagonist reached the Pokémon League only to find that N had already been there and defeated the champion with his newly arrived legendary Pokémon. The Elite Four could still be battled, but the championship itself had to be resolved through the encounter with N in the castle that rose up behind the league building, a confrontation that was as much ideological as competitive. The Alola League did not exist until Sun and Moon introduced it, because the island challenge structure had not previously included a formal championship. The first Alola League was established during the events of the game itself, and the protagonist was simultaneously its first champion and the cause of its creation. That simultaneity gave the league a different meaning in Alola than it had carried in other regions. Not an institution the protagonist was joining, but one they were founding, not a tradition they were honoring, but one they were beginning. The Galar League, by contrast, was the most established and publicly celebrated version of a championship structure the series had yet offered. Its stadiums, and its broadcast culture, and its champion Leon, who had never been defeated in an official match, gave the Galar protagonists something to approach that was both institutional and intensely personal. Defeating Leon was not just winning a tournament. It was ending a streak, shifting a cultural narrative, changing what Galar understood its own history to contain. The post-game content of each generation extends the protagonist's journey beyond the official conclusion and opens up spaces and encounters that the main story declined to include. These post-game regions and events are where some of the most interesting things happen, and they are often where the protagonist's relationship to the broader world of Pokémon becomes most explicit. The original post-game expansion in Gold and Silver, where the protagonist could cross the ocean to Kanto after becoming Johto champion, was foundational. It established the idea that a protagonist's world could be larger than any single region, that the journey did not end with a championship, but merely reached a resting point from which the next departure became possible. The battle frontier of Emerald and Platinum and Heart Gold and Soul Silver was the most elaborate post-game structure the series produced in its early generations, a place of specialized competitive challenges that required different skills than the main journey had demanded. A protagonist who cleared the battle frontier demonstrated a depth of tactical understanding that the ordinary journey could only begin to develop, and the frontier brain encounters that marked the highest achievements of those challenges were among the most demanding battles the series has ever offered. The Looker post-game investigations in X and Y and Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon used the protagonist in a different way, as a partner in a more narrative-focused side story that extended the Kalos and Alola journeys in a direction the main story had not gone. These investigations gave the protagonist a role as detective and witness, moving through the world with a different kind of attention than the gym challenge had required, noticing things that the main story's forward momentum had passed by. The Delta episode of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, as mentioned earlier, sent the protagonist to space and back, and its confrontation with Deoxys in the meteor's heart was one of the most cinematically constructed sequences the series had produced at that point. The protagonist moved through it not as a battler, so much as a witness to the culmination of forces that had been building beneath the main story's surface, and their presence in that moment was what made its resolution possible. There is a specific quality of light in the early morning sequences of Pokémon games that deserves a moment of attention. When the protagonist first steps outside, when the route opens in front of them, and the day has not yet accumulated any weight, the music that accompanies that moment is almost always gentle and ascending, full of the kind of careful optimism that belongs to beginnings. The composers who created these opening themes, Junichi Masuda in the early generations, and a growing team of collaborators in the later ones, understood something about the emotional requirement of those first moments outside. The music needed to communicate possibility without promising anything specific. It needed to be large enough that the world it introduced felt genuinely open, but not so dramatic that it implied a story already in progress. It needed to feel like morning. The music of the routes and towns and caves and forests of each region is one of the most significant elements of the protagonist's experience that is never directly discussed when people talk about what the journey was like, but it is always present and always working. The difference between the soundscape of Lavender Town and the soundscape of Ecruteak City and the soundscape of Laveridge Town tells you almost everything you need to know about what it felt like to stand in each of those places and to be the protagonist who had walked to them across the routes that preceded them. The composers understood the protagonist even when the protagonist had no lines to speak. They gave the protagonist's silence a texture, filled the space around the still and quiet figure with sound that expressed what the experience of moving through that world might feel like from the inside. The items that a protagonist carries across their journey are another quiet dimension of the story, one that most analysis of the games decline to examine closely. The Pokeballs in a protagonist's bag communicate something about their philosophy and their approach. The medicines they carry communicate something about their preparedness and their care for the Pokémon who travel with them. The TMs and HMs that accumulate over the course of the journey are a record of what the protagonist has learned and what they have been given by the people they have encountered. The old rod that a player receives in the early portions of the first games, and the good rod and super rod that follow it at different points in the journey, are a progression in the protagonist's ability to reach parts of the world that are not accessible to a person who simply walks. They represent an expanding capability, a growing access to the layers of the environment that an ordinary traveler would not know how to reach. The bicycle, that every protagonist receives at some point in their regional journey is another item that carries a specific meaning beyond its mechanical function. To move through the world on a bicycle is to be in it differently than to walk through it, faster and more purposeful, and the acquisition of the bicycle usually marks a specific point in the journey where the protagonist's relationship to the geography begins to shift from careful discovery to more confident traversal. The town map, or its regional equivalent, given to the protagonist early in each game by a companion or a family member, is an object that the protagonist uses throughout the journey to understand where they are relative to where they have been and where they are going. The map represents the fact that the world of each region has a shape, that its routes and towns are arranged in a specific relationship to each other, and that the protagonist's journey through them follows a geography that can be known and navigated. The Pokédex, which every protagonist receives at the very beginning of their journey from the regional professor, is the item that most completely defines what the protagonist is doing and why. It is both a record and a mission, both a history of what has already been found and an accounting of what remains to be discovered. To complete the Pokédex is to have stood in every part of the world and noticed what lived there, and no protagonist has ever done that alone, because some Pokémon are found only in other regions, or only in different versions of the same games, or only through trades with other players. The Pokédex is an incomplete project by design. It asks more of the protagonist than any single journey can provide. That incompleteness is not a failure, but a feature, a way of saying that the world is larger than any single journey, and that the relationships that extend the protagonist's reach into other players' games and other versions of the world are as essential as the walking itself. The professors of each region are figures who appear at the beginning and occasionally at the end of the protagonist's journey, and their function in the story is to give the Pokédex mission its legitimacy and its context. They are the adults who recognize what the protagonist is attempting and who provide the tools to attempt it. Their specializations, which vary across the generations and which give each professor their own character, communicate something about what their particular region values and what kind of knowledge its culture prioritizes. Professor Oak in Kanto was interested in the general relationship between Pokémon and people, a broad and foundational inquiry that matched the original game's role as an introduction to the entire premise. His research question, which the protagonist's journey was designed to advance, was about what it meant to share a world with creatures so varied and so capable. Professor Elm in Johto was interested in breeding and the life cycles of Pokémon, a more specific inquiry that matched the second generation's deeper engagement with the Pokémon world's biological and social complexity. His research required the protagonist to carry an egg and observe its development, which was one of the first moments in the series where the protagonist's journey served a clearly defined scientific purpose beyond the broad accumulation of Pokédex data. Professor Birch in Hoenn studied the environments that Pokémon lived in and the ways they were adapted to their specific habitats, an ecological approach that matched Hoenn's emphasis on different ecosystems and the dramatic ways the region's geography shaped the creatures who inhabited it. His encounter with the protagonist at the very beginning of the games, where he was being chased by a wild Pokémon and the protagonist had to choose a starter to rescue him, was one of the most memorable openings in the series, precisely because it did not begin with a calm laboratory, but with an outdoor emergency. Professor Rowan in Sinnoh studied Pokémon evolution, the process by which creatures transform across their life stages, and his research question matched the region's interest in transformation and in the deep historical processes that shaped the world over geological and mythological time. His manner, stern and demanding in comparison to the warmer professors of earlier generations, communicated something about the seriousness of the evolutionary questions Sinnoh's story would raise. The series of professors continued across every generation, each one contributing their own research interest and their own personality to the protagonist's beginning, each one serving as the figure who gave the journey its official sanction and its scientific context, even as the protagonist left the professor's laboratory behind and carried their own understanding of what they were doing into the world. There is something worth considering about what the protagonist's journey means for the ordinary people of the regions they move through. The games are populated by trainers and hikers and fishermen and bird catchers and swimmers and scientists who all wait along the routes and in the buildings, ready to battle the protagonist if their paths cross. Each of these figures has a single line of dialogue, sometimes two, and those lines communicate what their lives look like from the inside. The fisherman who has been sitting by the same pond for days. The hiker who climbed this mountain because it was there. The youngster who just got their first Pokémon and is eager to test it against anyone willing to stop and face them. These figures populate the world the protagonist moves through, and while the protagonist passes through their lives without stopping for long, the lives are genuinely there, genuinely ongoing. The people in the cities and towns who are not trainers to be battled, but simply inhabitants, have lines of dialogue that shift across the course of the game, reflecting what has happened in the story and what the protagonist has accomplished. They know, in some distributed way, that the protagonist is moving through their world, and that what the protagonist does matters to the broader community of the region. This ambient awareness, this sense that the protagonist is known and observed and occasionally depended upon, is what makes the Pokémon world feel inhabited rather than simply decorative. The towns are not backdrops. They are places where people live, and those people's lives are affected by the same forces that the protagonist is navigating. When Team Rocket or Team Galactic or Team Plasma or any of the antagonist groups disrupts the ordinary life of a region, the people of that region express their disruption in those single lines of dialogue, and the protagonist's passage through the world to resolve the disruption is something those people are watching and in their quiet way counting on. The legendary Pokémon that each protagonist encounters in the course of their journey are not simply the most powerful creatures in the world, though they are that. They are figures who embody the fundamental principles of their regions, the forces that shaped the land and the sky and the water, and the particular quality of time and space that gives each region its character. Mewtwo, who Red discovered in Cerulean Cave, was not a legendary in the sense that later generations would develop the concept. It was an artificial creature created through scientific intervention, a being that had been made rather than arisen, and that bore the weight of its own origin in a way that the natural legendaries did not. Its presence in Cerulean Cave, accessible only after the main story had concluded, gave it the quality of a secret, something the world had kept quietly, and the protagonist found by going further than the main path required. Lugia and Ho-Oh in Johto were figures of atmosphere rather than geology, creatures of sky and ocean and the quality of weather that connects those two spaces. Ho-Oh, perched on the brass tower before its destruction and seen briefly by the protagonist at the beginning of the Johto journey, flying overhead in a flash of rainbow color, was one of the most cinematically effective introductions of any legendary Pokémon, glimpsed before, understood, remembered before reached. Rayquaza, waiting at the top of Sky Pillar in Hoenn after the conflict between Kyogre and Gruden had made the weather of the region unlivable, was the legendary who arrived as a solution rather than a problem, a creature whose function was to end something rather than to embody it. Its descent through the sky to separate the two fighting forces was one of the most dramatically constructed story sequences the series had produced to that point, and the protagonist who had climbed Sky Pillar alone to summon it had done so through a specific and considerable effort. The legendaries of Sinnoh, Dialga, and Palkia, and Giratina were the most explicitly cosmological creatures the series had yet introduced, beings who were time and space themselves, rather than creatures who happened to embody those concepts. To encounter them in the context of the Sinnoh story was to encounter the foundations of existence at an experiential level that the protagonist was not quite supposed to be able to reach, but reached anyway because the journey demanded it. The friendship mechanic that has existed in various forms across the generations of Pokémon games is one of the most quietly significant elements of the protagonist's relationship to their team. When a Pokémon's friendship with its trainer is high enough, certain evolutions become possible, certain moves become available, certain battle behaviors emerge that reward the relationship itself, rather than just the accumulated statistics of training and experience. The friendship mechanic is a way of measuring something that the battles and the experience points cannot capture directly. The quality of the ongoing relationship between the protagonist and each Pokémon they travel with. A Pokémon that has been carried through many battles and healed carefully and given nutritious items and talked to at the right intervals has a different relationship to the protagonist than one that has been neglected, and the games register that difference in ways that have mechanical consequences. This encoding of relationship quality into game mechanics is one of the most human things about Pokémon, and it is part of what makes the protagonist's journey feel like a genuinely relational experience, rather than simply a sequence of challenges to be overcome. The protagonist grows in skill across the journey, but they also, if the player chooses to engage with the friendship system, grow in relationship, and that growth has its own kind of value that the experience point totals at the end of the journey do not capture. The Amity Square in Sinnoh, the various places in different regions where the protagonist could walk with their Pokémon outside of battle and simply spend time with them in a non-combative way, extended the friendship mechanic into something more visible and more emotionally direct. To walk through a park with a Pokémon beside you and to have that Pokémon occasionally pick up a small object or express its happiness was a simple thing that said something important about what the relationship was built on. Not only on battle, on presence, on the accumulation of ordinary time spent together. The Pokémon contests and similar performance-based competitions that have appeared across multiple generations of games represent another dimension of the protagonist's possible engagement with the world, one that places value on beauty and appeal and the careful cultivation of a Pokémon's expressive qualities rather than its combat effectiveness. The Pokémon contests of the Hoenn games and their super contest versions in the Sinnoh games ask the protagonist to develop their Pokémon's contest stats alongside their battle stats to feed them Poffins and Pokeblocks that enhance their condition for performance, or rather than their condition for fighting, and to choreograph their moves in ways that created an appealing combination of effects for the watching audience. The protagonist who engaged fully with the contest system moved through the Pokémon world in a genuinely different way than one who focused exclusively on the gym challenge, noticing different qualities in their Pokémon, developing different aspects of their relationship to them. A contest-focused protagonist was not a lesser version of a gym-focused one. They were a different kind of trainer, with a different set of priorities and a different understanding of what excellence in the Pokémon world could look like. Dawn's anime storyline, which built her arc primarily around contests rather than gym battles, gave this aspect of the protagonist's possible experience its fullest narrative development, showing what it looked like to pursue that particular form of excellence with genuine commitment and to grow through the failures and breakthroughs that the pursuit involved. The day and night cycle that Gold and Silver introduced which was one of the most significant mechanical innovations of the second generation, gave the protagonist's journey a temporal texture that the original games had lacked. Certain Pokémon appeared only at night. Certain events happened only in the morning or in the evening. The world of Johto was alive in different ways at different hours, and the protagonist who played at midnight encountered a different version of the world than the one who played at noon. This temporal dimension added a kind of authenticity to the protagonist's experience of the region. The world was not static, waiting for the protagonist to arrive and activate it. It was ongoing, changing, and the protagonist was entering it at a specific moment in its continuous unfolding. The protagonist who walked through Ecruteak City at midnight and found the kimono girls performing in the dance theater was encountering something that was happening, regardless of their presence, and something that the world was doing on its own schedule that they happened to arrive at the right moment to witness. The day and night cycle was refined and deepened across subsequent generations, but its emotional significance was established in Gold and Silver. The protagonist is moving through a world that has its own rhythms, and the experience of that world is shaped by when the protagonist arrives, and how long they stay, and what the light is doing at the moment they pass through any particular place. The wonder of each protagonist's journey, when you attend to it closely, is that it is always somehow the same journey, and always somehow a different one. The structure repeats: a small town, a first route, a first Pokémon received or chosen, a first gym, a series of expanding encounters with the world's complexity, a confrontation with a group whose ambitions threaten the region's stability, a resolution of that threat, and a final test at the League. The structure is clear, and it repeats across every game. But within that repeating structure, the specific texture of each journey is entirely different. The texture of walking through Kanto in the year the games were new, encountering a Pokémon world that had never been seen before, is different from the texture of walking through Unova with the specific questions about freedom and captivity that the black and white story raised, which is different from the texture of walking through Alola with the warmth of its islands and the weight of its family stories, which is different from walking through Paldea with its open-world invitation to go anywhere and discover things in whatever order the protagonist chose. The protagonist who walks through each of these worlds carries the same silence, the same readiness, the same quiet face looking forward at what is ahead. But what they are walking through is always particular, always shaped by the decisions that the designers made about what this region would care about and what this story would require. The protagonists are constant and the worlds are varied, and that combination of constancy and variation is what has allowed the series to remain both familiar and surprising across nearly 3 decades of games. There are small things, easily missed, that the games have included in the protagonist's experience across the generations that accumulate into a fuller picture of who these quiet figures are. The protagonist's bedroom at the beginning of each game, which the player walks through before stepping outside into the journey for the first time, is always a specific place with specific objects that communicate something about who lives there and what their life looked like before the journey began. Red's room had a Nintendo 64 in it, or what might have been a Nintendo 64, the kind of game system that a real child of that era would have in their room. That detail, small and easily overlooked, was a way of grounding the protagonist in an ordinary life before the journey, a reminder that Red was a child who played games before he began living inside one. The rooms of later protagonists carried their own specific details: posters on walls, books on shelves, boxes of belongings not yet unpacked, objects that suggested a life with its own texture and its own history. These details were never directly relevant to the main story. They could not be interacted with in ways that affected the journey, but they were there, communicating something about the person who had lived in that room before the adventure called them outside. The protagonist's mother, who appears at the beginning of each game and who sends the protagonist off into the world with a combination of warmth and practicality, is another figure whose small appearances accumulate into a portrait of the life the protagonist is leaving and the relationship that continues to hold them even as the journey carries them far from home. The mothers of the Pokémon protagonists save money and send it through the mail at intervals, a mechanic that several generations of games used to give the protagonist a small and regular reminder that home existed and that someone there was thinking of them. The money itself was useful, but the act of sending it and the message that accompanied it was what mattered most. The thread that connected the protagonist across all the distance of the journey to the bedroom they had left at the beginning of everything. As we approach the last quiet moment of this long journey through the facts of the Pokémon protagonists, it is worth resting for a moment with the simplest truth of all. These protagonists, with all their different designs and all their different regions and all their different stories, are beloved because they are present. They are always there, always showing up, always walking toward the next thing and arriving at it with the same open attention that every journey requires. They do not tire. They do not doubt. They face the mountains and the caves and the cities and the dark waters and the antagonists and the champions with the same quiet forward momentum that began in a small room in a small town on the first morning of a journey that was always somehow larger than anyone knew at the start. They are what beginning looks like in the world of Pokémon. They are what it means to take the first step, and because they carry the player with them in their silence, they are also what it means to be the one who takes that step, the one who says yes to the tall grass and the road beyond it, and everything that waits in the world that opens out from there. The journeys of the Pokémon protagonists are still being written. Somewhere, a new region is being designed, and a new protagonist is being sketched, and a new road is being drawn between new towns. That protagonist will stand at the beginning of their world with the same expression that Red once had, and that Gold once had, and that Brendan and May and Hilda and Hilbert and all the others have had. The expression of someone who is ready, and who knows that ready is enough. The tall grass waits. The morning light is just arriving. The Pokémon beside them is looking up at them with a patience that is also a kind of confidence. And when the protagonist takes the first step, the road will open, the music will rise gently, and the world will begin again. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet facts tonight, there is another video just to the left of your screen. Let it carry you a little further. You might find something gentle waiting there before sleep arrives. There are moments in every Pokémon protagonist's journey that the games mark as significant through their structure, but that are easy to pass through without fully recognizing what is happening. These moments accumulate quietly, and they are worth dwelling on before we let this exploration come to rest. The moment when the protagonist's rival appears for the first time after the opening is almost always a collision, literal or metaphorical. Blue runs into Red outside the lab. Barry crashes into the protagonist on the route outside Twin Leaf Town. Hop challenges the protagonist before they have even received a starter. These collisions are not accidents in the narrative sense. They are the first statement of the theme that will run through the entire journey. That the protagonist is not alone in the world they are exploring, that the road is shared, that the development happening inside the protagonist is also happening differently inside someone else. The rival is the protagonist's mirror, the figure who reflects back what the protagonist is becoming by showing an alternate version of the same process. When the rival succeeds, the protagonist sees what is possible. When the rival fails, the protagonist sees what is at stake. And when the rival eventually stands in the same final confrontation that the protagonist has been working toward, their presence there gives the protagonist's arrival a weight that it would not have if the road had been walked entirely alone. The rival is also, in the best cases, a person who is genuinely changing across the journey, rather than simply being a recurring obstacle. Blue's transition from arrogant competitor to thoughtful gym leader across the events of 2 generations. Hop's transition from aspiring champion to dedicated researcher. Silver's transition from angry loner to genuine trainer with a relationship to his Pokémon that he had previously refused to allow. These arcs unfold alongside the protagonist's arc, and they enrich the protagonist's story by showing that the journey changes everyone who undertakes it, not just the person at the center. The healing centers, Pokemon centers in most regions, are places the protagonist returns to again and again across the course of the journey, and their presence in every town and at every significant waypoint is one of the structural facts of the world that defines the protagonist's experience of it. To walk into a Pokemon Center is to enter a space of restoration, a pause in the forward movement of the journey where the accumulated damage of the road can be addressed before the protagonist continues. Nurse Joy, the figure who operates the centers in most regions, is always warm and always available, always ready to receive whatever the protagonist has brought back from the road and to return it healed and ready. Her presence is a kind of consistency in a journey full of the unexpected, a constant in a world of variables, and the protagonist's regular return to her care is one of the ways the games structure the rhythm of the journey. Advance, face challenges, sustain some damage, return to the center, restore, advance again. The moment of entering a Pokemon Center, particularly after a difficult stretch of road, is one of the most reliably comforting experiences in the protagonist's journey. The music shifts, the space is warm and bright, the Pokemon are healed. The protagonist can look at their party and see that everyone is all right, that the damage done on the road has been addressed, and that they are ready to go out again. This rhythm of advance and restoration is one of the most human rhythms the games encode, and it is part of why the Pokemon journey, for all its fantastical elements, feels emotionally recognizable. Everyone knows what it is to be worn down by effort and to need a moment of care before continuing. The Pokemon Center is where the protagonist receives that care, and the regularity of that reception is part of what makes the journey sustainable across its full length. The wild Pokemon encounters that fill the roots and caves and waters of every region are the constant texture of the protagonist's movement through the world. They are the most frequent events in the journey, more frequent than trainer battles and gym challenges and story encounters, and they shape the protagonist's experience of the road in ways that are easy to overlook precisely because they are so constant. Each wild encounter is a small decision point. Do I want to catch this Pokemon, or do I want to continue without engaging? The protagonist who walks through tall grass is always in a state of potential encounter, always moving through a world that might, at any moment, reveal a creature who wants to contend with them. That quality of constant potential, of the possibility of encounter embedded in every step across certain kinds of terrain, is part of what gives the Pokemon Road its specific texture. The strategy of catching versus fighting, of preserving resources versus expanding the party, of recognizing when a rare encounter deserves the investment of Ultra Balls and when an ordinary encounter can be passed by, is a form of judgment that the protagonist develops across the journey. Early in the game, every encounter feels potentially significant. The protagonist is still building their team, still unsure of what they need and what they have. Later, the encounters are more familiar, and the protagonist's relationship to them is more confident, more deliberate. The experience of finding a Pokemon that the protagonist has been specifically searching for, sometimes after hours of walking through the same tall grass in hopes of triggering the right encounter, is one of the most specific satisfactions the games offer. It is a satisfaction built on patience and persistence, on the willingness to keep walking through a world that has not yet given you the thing you are looking for, and on the faith that the thing is there even when it has not yet appeared. The trading mechanic that has been present in Pokémon since the very beginning is one of the most significant elements of the protagonist's relationship to the broader world of players, and it is worth considering what it means for the protagonist's experience that certain Pokémon can only be obtained through interaction with another player. The version exclusives that have existed since Red and Blue were two games that required each other to be fully complete, that could not be finished in the fullest sense by a single player working alone. To complete the Pokédex was always a social act, requiring relationships with other players who had made different choices and who could share what their version contained. The protagonist was never entirely alone in the journey because the journey's completion required the generosity of others. Trade evolutions took this further. Certain Pokémon would not evolve without being traded, requiring the protagonist to trust another player with their Pokémon and to receive it back transformed, changed by the act of passing through someone else's hands. This mechanic encoded something philosophically interesting about the Pokémon world's understanding of growth, that some transformations require the involvement of others, that certain kinds of becoming are only possible through relationship rather than through individual effort alone. The Pokémon world has always been, at its foundation, a world about connection. The protagonist's journey is one expression of that connection, the bond between trainer and Pokémon that grows across the road. But the trading mechanic and the version exclusives and the special event distributions that have made certain legendary Pokémon available only at specific times and places in the physical world have always extended that connection beyond the protagonist's individual experience into something genuinely communal. What makes the Pokémon protagonist compelling when everything has been said is not any single design or story or region or mechanical innovation. It is the consistency of the invitation. Every game that has featured a Pokémon protagonist has begun with the same essential offer. Here is a world. Here is a person at its edge. Here is a Pokémon waiting to be met. Come with them, see what they find. That invitation has been accepted billions of times across every generation of the franchise by players of every age and background and language. It has been accepted in bedrooms and on buses and in hospital waiting rooms and on quiet evenings when the rest of the house is asleep and the screen is the only light. It has been accepted by children who have grown into adults and by adults who remember being the children who accepted it the first time. The protagonist who carries all those acceptances is not a single character. They are a role, a possibility, an open space in the story where the player's own engagement becomes the character's presence. They are everyone who has ever walked into tall grass with a Pokémon beside them and felt, for the duration of that walk, that they were somewhere real and something true was happening. There are places in every Pokémon game that exist at the edge of the map, places the main story does not require the protagonist to visit, but that reward the player who chooses to go there anyway. These optional spaces, tucked behind HM requirements or hidden past unmarked routes, are where the world reveals things about itself that the central narrative does not need to say. They are where the protagonist becomes something more than the story's designated hero and begins to feel like a genuine inhabitant of the region, someone who has chosen to know it more completely than was strictly necessary. The islands accessible only by surfing across open water, the caves reachable only after earning the right move, the cellars and basements and mountain summits that the gym challenge never sends the protagonist toward. All of these places carry a quality of discovery that is purer than the directed discoveries of the main journey. Nothing is waiting there to advance the plot. No rival will appear to prompt the next beat. The protagonist arrives because they walked in that direction, because they were curious, because the world felt large enough to contain something worth finding if they looked. Some of these places contain legendary Pokémon, sleeping or waiting in spaces that feel ancient and specific to them, spaces that the world seems to have arranged itself around rather than containing as an afterthought. Others contain nothing that the game formally registers as significant, just environment, just the particular quality of light in a cave, or the sound of wind across a mountain pass, or the feel of tall grass at the edge of a route that the main path never required the protagonist to cross. These places exist not to be cleared, but to be visited, and the protagonist who visits them is practicing a kind of attention that the main story only occasionally requires. This optional geography is part of what makes every Pokemon region feel genuinely large. The protagonist who completes only the gym challenge and the main story has experienced a version of the region that is true and complete in its own terms. The protagonist, who also walks into every optional cave and crosses every unmarked route and climbs every summit that the HM repertoire eventually makes accessible, has experienced something richer, something that accumulates across the hours of a single playthrough into a relationship with the region that goes beyond what the story itself would have provided. The Pokemon who inhabit these optional spaces are sometimes the rarest and most unusual creatures in the regional roster, and their rarity is part of how the world communicates that these places are genuinely apart from the ordinary flow of the journey. A Pokemon that appears in only one cave at only one time of day, with only a small percentage chance of triggering an encounter when the protagonist walks through its habitat, is a Pokemon the world is keeping quietly, offering not as a given, but as a reward for sustained attention. The experience of encountering such a Pokemon for the first time, after the walking and the watching, and the patient willingness to keep moving through a space the story has not directed the protagonist toward, is one of the most genuinely surprising things the games offer. Not surprising, because it is unexpected in the mechanical sense. The protagonist knows they are looking for something, but surprising because the encounter arrives after enough time that the certainty of the search has become a kind of background rhythm, and the sudden appearance of what was being sought interrupts that rhythm with a clarity that feels disproportionate to the mechanics involved. These encounters are remembered. The cave in Kanto where Snorlax blocked the path and then became the largest Pokemon in the protagonist's party for a generation of players. The patches of grass outside Laveridge Town, where Skarmory appeared so rarely that encountering one felt like an event. The desert underpass in Hoenn, accessible only through the Game Corner prize exchange, which contained fossils from the past. The quiet summit of Mount Coronet in Sinnoh, where weather conditions changed and Pokemon not found anywhere else on the mountain appeared in the altered air. Each of these spaces was a world the main story did not open, but that the protagonist could open by choosing to go there. The relationship between the protagonist and the region's geography changes across the course of the journey, in ways that are worth tracing carefully. At the beginning, the protagonist is new to the world, and the world is opaque, presenting itself one route and one town at a time, requiring the protagonist to move through it sequentially, and to take what each section offers before the next section becomes accessible. The world is a series of doors, and the protagonist opens them in order. But as the journey progresses, as HMs are earned, and gyms are cleared, and the protagonist's range expands, the relationship to the geography shifts. The world stops being a sequence and becomes a space. The protagonist can return to places they have passed through, can reach areas that were blocked on the first approach, can overlay the new understanding of the region's shape onto the memory of what it felt like to move through it when its shape was still unknown. The map becomes familiar in the way that a place becomes familiar, only after you have been in it more than once, when you know where the roads go and what waits at the end of them. This shift from opacity to familiarity is one of the quiet emotional arcs of every Pokemon game, running beneath the surface of the main story's events and shaping the protagonist's experience of the world in ways that the story itself does not register. The protagonist who returns to Pallet Town after earning all 8 Kanto badges has a different relationship to that small 2-house settlement than they had when they left it with a starter Pokémon and a Pokédex. They have been away, the world has opened, and Pallet Town is still there, unchanged, waiting, carrying the accumulated meaning of everything that has happened since the first time the protagonist walked out its front door into the tall grass. The visual design of each Pokémon game's world communicates the character of the region through details that are easy to pass over without pausing to notice. The colors chosen for each town, the architectural styles that distinguish one settlement from another, the specific qualities of the natural environments between towns, all of these are choices made by designers who understood that the world of a region is as much a mood as a geography. Kanto was built in shades of primary simplicity, its towns named for colors, its design reflecting the honest directness of a first game, a first world, a palette that was not yet self-conscious about its own aesthetics. The Pokémon Red and Blue world was also a world of hardware limitations, and those limitations shaped every visual choice. But within them, the designers created something that felt internally consistent, a world that looked like itself, rather than like an approximation of something more ambitious. Johto added a layer of cultural specificity to the visual language, drawing more explicitly from traditional Japanese aesthetics in its architecture and its naming and its particular sense of time. Ecruteak City felt old in a way that the Game Boy Color could only suggest at the pixel level, but suggest it did through the design of the burned tower, through the kimono imagery, through the specific arrangement of its streets, and its connection to the mythology of the beasts that had once lived in the ruins at its center. The region felt like a place that had history and knew it, and the protagonist's movement through that history was part of what the Johto journey asked of them. Hoenn was visually organized around abundance, around the sense that the natural world of this region was genuinely rich and various and sometimes overwhelming. The ocean routes stretched beyond what any earlier game had offered in terms of open water traversal. The weather conditions shifted as the protagonist moved from the dry eastern highlands to the wet western rainforest, and those shifts were visible in the palette and the Pokémon available in each environment. The region felt alive in a way that was partly its own story and partly the result of the hardware leap that the Game Boy Advance represented, a screen capable of more colors, sprites capable of more detail, worlds capable of more visual texture. Sinnoh was defined visually by its verticality and its atmosphere. The mountain at its center cast a shadow over the whole region, not literally, but in the sense that every part of the geography existed in relationship to what waited at the top of that mountain. The underground passages added a dimension below the surface. The distortion world added a dimension above and outside ordinary space. The visual design of Sinnoh was interested in depth in every available direction, and the protagonist who moved through it was always moving in relation to something above or below or beyond the visible. Unova was the first Pokémon region to commit fully to an urban aesthetic, and its visual design reflected that commitment in the density of its city environments, in the bridges that connected its boroughs, in the contrast between the dense commercial center of Castelia and the quieter neighborhoods at the region's edges. The protagonist of Unova moved through a world that felt like a place people actually lived in, rather than a place arranged for a trainer's journey through it. And that quality of genuine habitation shaped the visual texture of the region, from its backgrounds to its NPC designs. Kalos was defined by its elegance, by a visual language that leaned into beauty as a design principle rather than simply as an aesthetic outcome. The grand boulevard of Lumiose City, the flower fields of the mid-region routes, The formal gardens and the graceful architecture of the cities all communicated that this was a region where beauty was understood as a value, as something the world arranged itself to produce and to honor. The protagonist moved through a world that was aware of its own attractiveness, and that self-awareness was part of the Kalos experience. Alola was the most chromatically joyful of the regions, built in warm colors and sunny landscapes that communicated the specific character of a Pacific island culture and climate. The volcanic terrain of one island, the marine research station of another, the mountain snow of a third, the canyon and coastal diversity of the fourth, all of these environments existed in the same regional palette while still being distinctly themselves, a visual variety that matched the cultural richness of a region built on the meeting of different traditions and different ways of understanding the relationship between people and the natural world. Galar's visual design leaned into the romanticism of the British landscape, into the specific quality of light that falls on green hills under overcast skies, into the particular combination of old stone and industrial metal that characterizes the British-built environment. The wild area, a large open space at the center of the region, was visually distinct from anything the series had previously offered, an expanse of varied terrain under a sky whose weather changed in real time, affecting which Pokémon appeared and creating a sense of the natural world as genuinely dynamic rather than static. Paldea's visual design was the warmest and most Mediterranean of any region the series had produced, built in the colors of the Iberian Peninsula, in terracotta and golden stone, and the particular blue of a sky that is genuinely southern. The open-world structure meant that the protagonist could stand in many parts of the region and see the whole of it spreading in multiple directions, the mountains visible from the coast and the coast visible from the mountains. The various environments of the region present to the eye simultaneously in a way that earlier games had not offered. The HM system that defined travel in the early generations of Pokémon games was one of the most distinctive mechanical features of the protagonist's engagement with the world, and it shaped the experience of the journey in ways that both expanded and constrained what was possible. The protagonist, who had not yet acquired Surf, could not cross the bodies of water that divided many of the early regions into accessible and inaccessible halves. The protagonist, who had not yet acquired Strength, could not move the boulders that blocked certain cave passages. The world was permeable in some directions and impassable in others, and the HMs were the keys that gradually unlocked the full extent of the geography. This system meant that the protagonist's movement through the world was layered, that a place visited early in the game could become newly accessible later, that the geography revealed itself not all at once, but gradually, as the protagonist accumulated the tools to interact with its different elements. The Pokémon who learned HMs were valued not only for their battle capabilities, but for their utility as navigational tools, and many players had a dedicated HM user in their party, a creature whose role was not to battle, but to enable movement through the parts of the world that ordinary walking could not reach. The decision to move away from the HM system in later generations, replacing it with ride Pokémon in Alola and with the freely available mounts of Galar and Paldea, changed the protagonist's relationship to the geography in significant ways. The world became more immediately permeable, more accessible from early in the game, less structured around the sequential unlocking of movement capabilities. The freedom this provided was genuine and valued by many players, but it also changed something about the texture of discovery, the particular satisfaction of returning to a previously impassable place with the newly acquired ability to cross it and finding what waited on the other side. The ride Pokémon of Alola, summoned by a ride pager and appearing from wherever they happened to be to carry the protagonist across water or up cliffs or through the air, were conceptually interesting as an alternative to the HM system. They suggested a world in which Pokémon were genuinely integrated into the practical life of the region, in which the protagonist's movement through the landscape was made possible by ongoing relationships with specific creatures rather than by technical moves taught to members of the party. The Stoutland that let the protagonist sniff out hidden items, the Lapras that carried them across the sea, the Charizard that lifted them into the sky. Each of these relationships had a different quality from the HM users of earlier games, more collaborative and less utilitarian. The Pokémon box system that allows the protagonist to store Pokémon beyond the 6 permitted in the active party is one of the mechanical features of the series that has the most interesting philosophical implications for the protagonist's relationship to their captured creatures. A protagonist box contains, over the course of a long playthrough, dozens or hundreds of Pokémon, each one caught at a specific moment in the journey and placed in storage when the party roster was already full. What does it mean for these stored Pokémon within the fiction of the world to exist in that state of suspension? The games do not dwell on this question, but the presence of the box system as a feature of the world means the question exists even if it is not answered. The protagonist who has caught a Caterpie on Route 1 and placed it in the box and never interacted with it again for the remaining 80 hours of the playthrough has a relationship to that Caterpiece that is technically one of ownership, but practically one of absence. The Caterpie is there in the record, but not in the experience. The introduction of Pokémon Ami in X and Y, and its successors, Pokémon Refresh and Pokémon Camp in later games, gave the protagonist new ways of interacting with their stored Pokémon, feeding them and playing with them, and developing the friendship metrics that influenced certain evolutions and battle behaviors. These features were not required for completing the main story, but they offered the protagonist a way of engaging with the box's contents as something more than an inventory, as a collection of creatures who had their own ongoing states of well-being that the protagonist could tend to or neglect. The Pokémon Camp of Sword and Shield, which allowed the protagonist to set up a campsite and cook curry and play with the full party in a shared space, was perhaps the most direct expression of this engagement, giving the protagonist and their Pokémon a place to simply exist together without any battle or competition framing the interaction. The curry cooking mechanic, in which the quality of the food prepared affected the Pokémon's mood and experience gain, was charmingly practical in its suggestion that care and feeding were as important to the relationship as training and battling. The protagonist's relationship to money across the journey is another dimension of the experience that is easy to take for granted, but that shapes the practical texture of every day on the road. The protagonist earns money through battles, and that money funds the purchase of Pokeballs and medicines and the various other items that the journey requires. The economy of the Pokémon world, as the protagonist encounters it, is organized around the trainer's need, with shops stocked with precisely the items that the protagonist's current location and progress require. This economic logic means that the protagonist moves through a world that is, in a quiet way, designed for them, that the shops and items available at each point in the journey match the challenges that the journey is about to present. The shops of the early routes carry basic Pokeballs and basic medicines. The shops of the cities carry more specialized items as the protagonist's needs become more specific. The department stores of the major urban centers carry everything, but only the protagonist who has reached them and who has accumulated enough money through battles can take full advantage of what they contain. The protagonist who loses a battle and is sent back to the last Pokémon Center with reduced funds is experiencing one of the journey's gentler forms of failure, a consequence that is real without being catastrophic, a reminder that the road requires resources and that those resources need to be managed. The decision to carry extra revives or to spend the money on a new TM, to invest in the long term, or to prepare for the immediate challenge, is a form of practical judgment that the journey develops slowly through the accumulated experience of many small purchases and many small consequences. The amulet coin and the luck incense, items that doubled the prize money earned from trainer battles, were the protagonist's tools for accelerating this economic accumulation, and the decision to use a party slot on a Pokémon holding one of these items, trading some battle versatility for increased earning potential, was itself a form of strategic judgment that the games rewarded with practical benefit. The protagonist who thought about money was the protagonist who could eventually afford the most powerful TMs and the rarest items, and that long-term economic planning was its own form of preparation for the journey's later challenges. The protagonist's name, which the player provides at the beginning of the game, is one of the most personal elements of the entire experience. The name appears on the trainer card in the dialogue when NPCs address the protagonist directly, in the record of gym badges and Hall of Fame entries that accumulates across the playthrough. It is the player's insertion into the protagonist's identity, the point where the fictional character and the real person who is playing most directly overlap. Some players name the protagonist after themselves, collapsing the distance between player and character entirely, and treating the journey as something that is happening to them in the most direct possible sense. Others name the protagonist something entirely different, constructing a character who is genuinely separate from the player and whose journey is a narrative experience rather than a personal one. Many players fall somewhere between these approaches, naming the protagonist something that feels connected to them without being identical, a nickname or a character from another story they care about, or a name they have always liked. The game accommodates all of these approaches without distinguishing between them. The protagonist's name does not change anything about the mechanics of the journey or the outcome of any encounter. It changes only the most personal dimension of the experience, the sense of whose name is on the Hall of Fame entry, whose name the champion calls out when the final battle concludes, whose name appears on the ribbon of a Pokémon first caught on this playthrough and then traded to someone else's game, carrying the original trainer's mark with it into a new context. The tradition of naming Pokémon themselves is another dimension of this personalization, one that the series has always supported but never required. A protagonist who names every Pokémon they catch has a different relationship to their party than one who leaves the default species names in place. The named Pokémon is an individual in a way that the unnamed one is not quite, a creature with a specific identity within the protagonist's story, rather than simply a representative of its species. The Pokémon who become genuinely beloved across generations of players are not always the ones the games are most careful to present as significant. They are sometimes the ones who simply happened to be present at the right moment, who were caught early enough in the journey to be present for everything that followed, who were the protagonist's starter, or the first Pokémon caught after the starter, or the one who arrived at exactly the critical moment in a difficult battle and did what needed to be done. These creatures become beloved through accumulated experience rather than through design. The Rattata that a player catches on Route 1 in Kanto and keeps in their party through the entire playthrough, leveling it against every trainer and healing it carefully and giving it a name, has been transformed by that investment into something that the game's designers did not specifically intend and could not have specifically designed. It is a beloved Rattata, and it is beloved not because Rattata is a particularly impressive Pokémon by any objective measure, but because this particular one was there and kept being there and proved capable in the ways that were needed when they were needed. The Nuzlocke challenge, which many players impose on themselves voluntarily, makes this process of attachment more formal and more fragile simultaneously. Under Nuzlocke rules, if a Pokémon faints, it is considered dead and must be released or permanently boxed. This rule, and the additional rule that the player can only catch the first Pokémon encountered on each new route, creates conditions under which every Pokemon becomes more individually significant because the party is smaller and the losses are permanent, and the creatures who remain are the ones who have survived everything that has happened so far. The Nuzlocke experience of Pokemon is a different kind of protagonist experience than the standard game offers, one in which the emotional stakes of each battle are higher and the relationships with the surviving Pokemon are consequently more intense. A Nuzlocke protagonist who reaches the Pokemon League with a party of creatures who have been together since the early roots has a relationship to those specific individuals that is qualitatively different from a standard playthrough, shaped by the losses that were not survived and the close calls that were, by the accumulating history of a shared journey that felt genuinely dangerous. The way each generation of Pokemon games handles the protagonist's arrival at a new city, for the first time, is a small but precise form of narrative architecture. The music shifts, marking the transition from route to settlement. The visual environment changes, moving from open natural space to enclosed built space. NPCs populate the streets, each one with a line or two of dialogue that communicates something about what kind of place this is and what it values and what has been happening here recently. The protagonist's entrance into Goldenrod City in Johto, with its department store and its radio tower and its underground tunnel and the particular energy of the busiest commercial center in the region, communicated something about the scale and the character of Johto's largest settlement that would have been impossible to convey through description alone. The player feels the city by moving through it, by finding its corners and its shops and its hidden passages, by accumulating the specific knowledge of what this place contains and how it is organized. Castelia City in Unova was the first city in the series that genuinely felt like a metropolis, with its long avenues running from the docks to the uptown areas, with its ice cream vendor and its art gallery and its battle company, and the particular anonymous energy of a very large city full of people pursuing their own specific purposes. The protagonist moved through Castelia with the slight disorientation of a person who has arrived in a place larger than any they have previously navigated, and that disorientation was honest to the experience of a young person encountering a genuine city for the first time. Lumiose City in Kalos was the most ambitious urban environment the series had yet attempted, a circular city organized around a central tower that served as both landmark and literal destination, with avenues radiating outward from the center, and restaurants and boutiques, and a museum and a hotel, and all the varied infrastructure of a genuinely cosmopolitan place. The three-dimensional rendering of Lumiose on the Nintendo 3DS gave it a spatial quality that no previous Pokémon city had quite achieved, and getting lost in it was a real possibility that the game incorporated as part of the experience. The evolution sequences that occur when a Pokémon reaches the right level or meets the right condition are among the most ritually significant moments of the protagonist's journey. Small ceremonies of transformation that the game marks with music and light and the slow revelation of a new form. These sequences are not just mechanical transitions from one set of statistics to another. They are moments where something the protagonist has been nurturing reveals what it was becoming, where the potential that the journey has been developing shows itself as actual. The first evolution is always surprising in a way that later ones are not quite. The Charmander, that has been the protagonist's companion since the very beginning, suddenly growing into a Charmeleon with a more angular posture and a sharper edge to its flame, is the same creature and is not the same creature simultaneously. The continuity of the experience, the accumulated battles, and the healed damage and the stored levels is preserved across the transformation. But the form has changed, and the protagonist's relationship to the form changes with it. Some evolutions were anticipated, part of the planned development of a Pokémon the protagonist had obtained specifically because they wanted what it was going to become. Others were surprises, the product of conditions the protagonist did not know they had been meeting, the Pokémon suddenly evolving because the friendship was higher than the protagonist had realized, or because the day had become night, or because the protagonist had walked a specific number of steps with it in the party. These surprise evolutions were among the genuine revelations the games offered, moments where the world demonstrated that it was tracking things the protagonist had not been tracking, rewarding attention and care that had felt casual rather than deliberate. The traded Pokémon that evolved upon being received back, transformation triggered by the act of exchange itself, made the evolution mechanic a social event in those cases, something that required the involvement of another player, and that happened in the moment of reconnection rather than in the moment of individual achievement. These evolutions were among the most distinctive experiences the series offered precisely because they could not be accomplished alone, because they required trust and the willingness to let a Pokémon pass through someone else's hands. The battle interface that every protagonist interacts with hundreds of times across the course of each game is a form of communication between the player and the world, and its design across the generations reveals how the series' understanding of what the protagonist is doing in battle has evolved. The early generations presented battle in simple terms: 4 moves, each with a type and a power level, and a limited number of uses. The protagonist chose among them, and the outcome was determined by a combination of the chosen moves and the statistics of the 2 Pokémon involved, and a small element of randomness that kept each battle from being perfectly predictable. The strategy was real, but the interface was minimal, designed to communicate the essential information without overwhelming the player with detail. Later generations added abilities, which changed the passive behavior of Pokémon in battle in ways that required the protagonist to understand not just their own team's mechanics, but the mechanics of every Pokémon they were likely to encounter. The protagonist who knew that a Pokémon had Intimidate, which lowered the opponent's attack when the Pokémon was sent into battle, could plan their approach to that battle differently than one who did not. This additional layer of mechanical knowledge became part of what it meant to be a prepared protagonist, a trainer who understood not just the surface of the battle system, but its underlying logic. Held items, introduced in the second generation, added another dimension to the protagonist's preparation. A Pokémon holding a leftovers recovered a small amount of health at the end of each turn. One holding a choice band hit harder, but was locked into the first move it selected each time it was sent into battle. These items transformed the party preparation phase into a form of tactical assembly, each decision about what to equip affecting the dynamic of battles, hours or days later in the journey. The Mega Evolution mechanic introduced in X and Y gave the protagonist's relationship to certain Pokémon a new kind of depth, a temporary transformation tied specifically to the bond between trainer and Pokémon, and expressed through the Keystone and the Pokémon's corresponding Megastone. The protagonist who triggered Mega Evolution was making a statement within the battle about the relationship they had with that specific Pokémon, asserting a connection that had a visible effect on the Pokémon's power and appearance. The transformation was beautiful in many cases, dramatic and immediate, and it gave the late stages of difficult battles a visual and emotional register that the standard battle interface had not offered. Dynamax and Galar and Z moves in Alola served similar structural functions, giving the protagonist a climactic option in high-stakes battles that went beyond the ordinary vocabulary of 4 moves and switch decisions. Each of these systems communicated something slightly different about what kind of power the protagonist could call on and what the relationship between trainer and Pokémon that made that power possible looked like. Zing moves were tied to specific moves or types, requiring alignment between the protagonist's strategy and the specific capabilities of the Pokémon using them. Dynamax was available to any Pokémon, but only once per battle, creating a strategic question about when to deploy it that the protagonist had to answer in the moment, with incomplete information about what the opponent would do next. The protagonist of each generation exists in a specific historical moment within the Pokémon world, and the events of that moment shape what the journey means and what is at stake in it. The protagonist of Red and Blue moved through a world that was still working out its relationship to the new technology of Pokémon training, where the criminal organization Team Rocket was attempting to exploit that relationship for profit, and where the protagonist's journey was implicitly a demonstration that the relationship could be something more genuine and more reciprocal than exploitation allowed. The protagonist of Gold and Silver moved through a world that was still recovering from the defeat of Team Rocket 3 years earlier, where the remnants of the organization were attempting to revive their ambitions under the leadership of a radio station executive who had served Giovanni without fully taking on his identity. This context gave the Johto journey a quality of living in the aftermath of moving through a world that had already been changed by what a previous protagonist had done, and that was not quite finished processing that change. The protagonist of Diamond and Pearl moved through a world that Cyrus was attempting to unmake, where the very fabric of time and space was in danger not from criminals seeking profit, but from a philosopher who had concluded that existence itself was flawed and needed to be replaced. The stakes of the Sinnoh journey were cosmological in a way that no previous generation had quite achieved, and the protagonist who stood at the spear pillar and faced the awakened deities of time and space was doing something that went beyond defeating a villain and closer to witnessing the edge of what the world could contain. The protagonist of Black and White moved through a world that was genuinely arguing with itself about the ethics of Pokémon training, where the antagonist's question whether keeping Pokémon was fundamentally a form of domination that needed to end was not dismissed by the narrative, but engaged with, complicated, and ultimately answered through the protagonist's demonstration that the relationship could be genuine partnership rather than ownership. The protagonist who cleared Unova had done something philosophically as well as practically, not just winning a battle, but participating in an argument about what the world's most fundamental relationship was supposed to look like. The relationship between the protagonist and the professor of each region is one of the few genuinely adult relationships in the protagonist's experience of the journey, a relationship with someone who has accumulated knowledge and who extends some of that knowledge to the protagonist at the beginning and who waits to hear what the protagonist has discovered at the end. The professor is the institutional frame around the journey, the figure who gives it a purpose that extends beyond personal achievement and connects it to a broader project of understanding the world. This relationship is mostly one-directional in its practical expression. The professor provides the starter Pokémon and the Pokédex, and occasionally appears at significant moments in the story to add context or deliver information that the protagonist needs. The protagonist does not consult the professor regularly or develop the relationship through ongoing conversation. But the fact of the relationship, its existence as a frame around the journey, gives the protagonist's movement through the world a quality of being witnessed and valued by someone with the standing to assess what the journey is accomplishing. The professors of later generations have been more integrated into the main story than Professor Oak and Professor Elm were in the early games. Their research questions more directly relevant to the conflicts and discoveries of the main narrative. Professor Sycamore in Kalos was genuinely involved in the story of Mega Evolution and its connection to the Ultimate Weapons history. Professor Kukui in Alola was the founder of the new Pokémon League and the final opponent the protagonist faced to establish the championship. Professor Magnolia in Galar had done the foundational research on Dynamax that made the events of the Sword and Shield story comprehensible. This increasing integration of the professor into the main narrative reflects a broader shift in how the series constructs the relationship between the protagonist and the institutional structures of the region. In the early games, the professor was at the periphery of the story, providing context but not participating in events. In the later games, the protagonist and the professor exist in the same narrative space, their respective projects intersecting and informing each other in ways that make the academic dimension of the journey feel genuinely relevant to what is happening in the world. The antagonist organizations of each region are as much a part of the protagonist's story as the protagonists themselves, because their ambitions and their methods define the specific shape of the threat that the protagonist's journey is implicitly organized to counter. Each organization has a philosophy, however distorted, that says something about the fears and fantasies of its particular generation. Team Rocket in Kanto was organized crime in a straightforward sense, interested in money and power through the exploitation of Pokémon as resources. Their methods were brutal, but their goals were recognizable, and the protagonist who dismantled their operations was doing something that the world's other institutional structures, the gym system, the police, the professors, had apparently been unable to accomplish. The protagonist's effectiveness against Team Rocket established something important about what a single determined trainer could accomplish against a corrupt and powerful organization. Team Magma and Team Aqua in Hoenn introduced the idea that antagonist organizations could have genuinely opposing goals, that the conflict the protagonist needed to resolve was not simply between the protagonist and a single villain, but between two forces whose ambitions were incompatible with each other and with the world's stability. The protagonist's role in that conflict was not to choose a side, but to prevent either side from succeeding, to maintain a balance that both organizations were threatening from different directions. Team Galactic in Sinnoh was organized around a philosophy of nihilism and reconstruction, around the belief that the existing universe was fundamentally inadequate and needed to be replaced with something purer. Their crimes in the service of this philosophy, capturing the legendary Pokémon whose power Cyrus needed to remake the world, were means to an end so abstract that the protagonist's opposition to them had to be maintained on practical grounds rather than on the philosophical grounds, where Cyrus was most comfortable arguing. The protagonist could not win the argument with Cyrus. They could only prevent the consequences of the argument from being implemented. Team Plasma in Unova and the specific philosophy N, articulated on their behalf, represented the most genuine intellectual challenge that the series had posed through an antagonist organization, because the challenge was not merely practical, but ethical. The protagonist who defeated Team Plasma had to answer N's question about whether Pokémon partnership was genuine, and the answer the games offered was not a refutation of N's concern, but a demonstration that the concern, while real, was not incompatible with the relationship existing in a form that served both humans and Pokémon, rather than exploiting either. Team Flare in Kalos was interested in beauty and exclusivity in a world from which ugliness and scarcity had been eliminated by eliminating most of the people in it. Their philosophy was the most clearly monstrous of any antagonist organizations, less interested in a genuine vision of a better world than in preserving the world's beauty for those they considered worthy of it. The protagonist who stopped Team Flare was stopping something closer to pure destruction than any previous antagonist had represented, and the weight of what the ultimate weapon had already done in the past gave the Kalos story its particular quality of confronting inherited horror. The protagonist's journey through each game also has a quality of accumulation that extends beyond the Pokémon in the party and the badges on the trainer card. The protagonist accumulates knowledge of the world, understanding of what the region contains and how its various parts relate to each other, familiarity with the people and places encountered along the way. This accumulated knowledge is not formally recorded by the game in the way that the Pokédex records encountered species, but it exists as a dimension of the player's experience of the journey and shapes how the later parts of the game feel relative to the earlier parts. The protagonist who has traveled through the whole of a region and then returns to a place visited early in the journey carries that return differently than a first time visitor would. They know what route leads here and what route leads out. They know what the shopkeeper sells and what the local gym leader specializes in. They have already been through the tall grass outside this town, and they know what Pokémon wait there. The world is familiar in the way that a place becomes familiar only through having been in it, and that familiarity is a form of belonging that the early parts of the journey could not have provided. This sense of belonging to the region, of having earned the right to navigate it with confidence, is one of the quieter satisfactions of a completed Pokémon playthrough. The protagonist who has cleared all 8 gyms and defeated the Elite Four and explored the optional areas and completed as much of the Pokédex as the single game experience allows, has a relationship to the region that is genuinely their own, built from everything they chose to do and everywhere they chose to go across the full length of the journey. The Pokémon Mystery Dungeon games occupy a genuinely different space in the protagonist tradition, one worth considering in some depth before this exploration comes to rest. In those games, the protagonist is a human who has become a Pokémon, arriving in a world of Pokémon without any of the social or institutional framework that a human trainer would bring. They must build their identity from the beginning, finding a partner, joining a rescue team, navigating a world that operates by different rules than the one they remember. The protagonist of Red Rescue Team and Blue Rescue Team could be any of the initial Pokémon available at the start, chosen through a personality quiz that matched the player's answers to a specific species, and the partner Pokémon was chosen from a different list. These choices shaped the mechanical experience of the game, different species having different starting moves and different stat profiles, but more significantly, they shaped the emotional experience of playing as that specific creature in that specific pairing, building a rescue team that had its own character based on who had been put together at the beginning. Explorers of Time and Explorers of Darkness and Explorers of Sky expanded the Mystery Dungeon format in narrative scope and emotional depth, building a story about time distortion and sacrifice and the willingness to give up something essential for the sake of something larger. The protagonist of those games, who came to understand across the course of the story that they were a figure from the future who had traveled back to prevent a catastrophe, and who, having succeeded, might not be able to continue existing in the present they had saved, was perhaps the most emotionally complex protagonist the Pokémon franchise had produced in any medium. The moment at the end of Explorer of the Sky's extended post-game, where the partner discovers a way to bring the protagonist back from the state of dissolution they had entered after the story's conclusion, remains one of the most genuinely affecting sequences the franchise has offered, built not on dramatic action, but on the accumulated emotional weight of everything that had passed between the protagonist and the partner across the full length of the game. The reunion was earned by everything that had preceded it, by every rescue mission and every dungeon cleared and every conversation held between the two small creatures who had chosen to face everything the world presented together. The protagonist is always at the beginning of something. Even when the journey has reached the Pokémon League and the champion has been defeated and the credits have rolled and the post-game world has opened with its new challenges and its optional legendaries and its expanded roster of encounters, the protagonist is still available to walk through the world they have navigated, still capable of beginning again in the tall grass, still open to what might arrive in the next encounter. The end of the main story is not the end of the protagonist's existence in the world. It is the opening of a different kind of possibility, a world fully known at last, and therefore fully available for whatever the protagonist chooses to do with it next. The protagonist is always young, as was noted before, but there is something more precise to say about what that youth means in the context of everything that happens during the journey. Youth in the Pokemon world is not a limitation, it is the condition of maximum openness, the state in which the most learning is possible, and the most relationships are available to be formed, and the most of what the world contains can still arrive as genuine discovery rather than as confirmation of what was already known. The protagonist is young because the journey is designed for someone who can receive everything it offers without the weight of prior knowledge and prior attachment closing off what would otherwise remain available. And the protagonist is quiet because the quietness is what makes the space that the player fills. The silent protagonist is an invitation, a container, a vessel shaped to hold whatever the player brings to the journey. Every protagonist in every Pokémon game is simultaneously very specific, a designed character with a designed appearance and a designed set of relationships and a designed story, and completely open, a space in the narrative where the player's own investment and imagination and care complete the character in ways the designers cannot and do not need to specify. That openness is the most essential quality of the Pokémon protagonist, more essential than any specific design or any specific region or any specific mechanical feature of the game. It is what the protagonist has always been and what every future protagonist will be, from the first game to whatever comes next, from the pixel sprites of the Game Boy era to the high-resolution models of the Nintendo Switch and whatever hardware succeeds it. The protagonist is open, the world is wide, the tall grass is just ahead. The sounds of the Pokémon world deserve their own careful attention because they are one of the most powerful dimensions of the protagonist's experience of each region and one of the most consistently under-examined. Every Pokémon has a cry, a sound that plays when it enters battle or is encountered in the wild, and those cries have their own history across the generations, evolving from the simple, synthesized tones of the early Game Boy era to the increasingly rich audio of later hardware. The original cries of Generation 1 Pokémon were simple enough that they became deeply recognizable through sheer repetition, the particular electronic squeal of a Pikachu, or the low warble of a Snorlax entering combat, so often heard that they bypassed conscious recognition and went directly to something more automatic, a sound recognized before it was processed. These cries were the protagonist's constant sonic companions across the early games. The audio texture of the encounter and their simplicity made them paradoxically more distinctive than more complex sounds might have been. The town and route music of each game carries the same kind of ambient emotional significance as the visual design of each environment. The music of Pallet Town, those first tentative notes suggesting smallness and openness and the sense of something about to begin, was teaching the player what this place was before they had walked far enough through it to understand it from its contents. The music arrived first, and the understanding of the place grew into it, the melody becoming retrospectively appropriate as the protagonist accumulated experience of what the town actually contained. The battle music of each game marks the emotional register of each encounter, distinguishing between the casual curiosity of a wild Pokémon encounter, the competitive tension of a trainer battle, the heightened stakes of a gym leader confrontation, and the ceremonial weight of an Elite Four or champion battle. Each of these battle contexts has its own musical signature in every generation, and the protagonist, who has played enough hours of any given game, begins to understand these signatures viscerally before the battle has properly begun, the music itself creating a form of anticipatory knowledge about what kind of challenge is coming. The legendary encounter music of each generation is among the most carefully crafted music the series has produced, designed to communicate that something unprecedented is happening, that the protagonist has arrived at a place and a moment that the journey has been moving toward without quite announcing itself as such. The silence before the music in a legendary encounter, the moment when the overworld sounds fade and the new music hasn't yet arrived, is itself a form of communication, a held breath before the exhale that the music represents. The Pokemon world contains a specific kind of background character who appears in many games and many contexts without ever being named or developing beyond their immediate purpose, and these background characters collectively create the texture of a world that is genuinely inhabited by more than just the protagonist and the named figures of the main story. They are the various trainers on the routes, the shopkeepers in every town, the scientists in every laboratory, the fishermen by every body of water, the hikers on every mountain trail. These background figures have single lines of dialogue that communicate entire lives in miniature. The young couple sitting on a bench in the park who mention that they have been coming to this park since they were children. The old man in a cave who warns the protagonist that the cave ahead is dangerous and adds that he has been saying the same thing for 30 years and nobody listens. The Pokemon trainer on a beach who mentions that they take this route every day because they like the view and the protagonist is the 15th person they have battled this week. These fragments suggest a world that has been going on before the protagonist arrived and will continue after the protagonist leaves, a world whose ordinary rhythms the protagonist's extraordinary journey is passing through rather than constituting. The background characters of the Pokemon world are not there to be defeated or helped or understood. They are there to be glimpsed, and the glimpse is enough to communicate that the protagonist is moving through something genuinely alive. The protagonist's passage through this background world changes it in small ways that the games occasionally register. An NPC who mentioned that they were afraid of a particular cave mite, after the protagonist has cleared the cave, mentioned that they heard the cave was safe now and might visit it. A town whose residents mentioned an ongoing problem might, after the protagonist has resolved it, mention the resolution with relief or gratitude, or simply with the satisfied acknowledgement that things are better now. These small changes are one of the ways the protagonist's journey is inscribed in the world, and they are more quietly satisfying than the dramatic moments of the main story because they are easy to miss and rewarding to notice. Every protagonist who has ever stood at the beginning of a Pokemon game and taken the first step into the tall grass has been carrying something invisible alongside their starter Pokemon and their empty Pokédex. They have been carrying the accumulated meaning of every protagonist who went before them, every Red and Gold, and Brendan and Hilda and Selena and Gloria, every quiet figure who walked through a different world with the same open expression and the same willingness to receive whatever the journey offered. This accumulated meaning is not stated in the games. It does not appear in any dialogue or any Pokédex entry. It exists in the player who comes to each new game already knowing what a Pokemon journey is, already carrying the emotional knowledge of what it means to walk through tall grass with a creature beside you that you have only just met and already started to know. The protagonist of each new generation inherits this knowledge without being told they have inherited it, and their journey is enriched by everything that the franchise has built across every previous generation of protagonists and journeys and regions and discoveries. The Pokemon franchise began with one child from one small town and has grown into a tradition so large that it touches billions of lives across dozens of countries and multiple generations of real-world time. Through all of that growth, the protagonist at the center of each game has remained essentially constant, young, quiet, ready, open to the world that is about to offer itself, accompanied by a Pokemon who is also at the beginning of something and who will grow alongside the protagonist across whatever the journey holds. That constancy is a form of promise, a promise that the world will always be there to be explored, that the tall grass will always contain something worth finding, that the Pokemon League will always be reachable from a small bedroom in a small town if the protagonist is willing to walk toward it and keep walking even when the road is difficult. A promise that the beginning is always available, that the journey can always be undertaken again, that whatever brought the protagonist here tonight, it was enough to bring them to the edge of something wide and waiting and entirely worth the walk. Thanks for watching. If these quiet details helped you relax, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. You can let it play as you close your eyes. You might hear something soothing before you fall asleep again.